The heroines were standing in a light forest. After William left the capital, she immediately managed to reunite with her son in Condor. The Holy Sword of the West looked ahead in surprise. There were many people in the clearing. The boy standing next to the horse looked back. The girl imagined how his mother knelt before her son and said that tears were blurring his eyes. Mikhail rolled his eyes and asked her to do without unnecessary details. Karyamon talked to his comrade. Since then, the woman quietly watched how he adapted among the mercenaries. He managed to easily enter the new society, especially after reuniting with his mother. The guy was smiling. The judge of lawlessness stood nearby. Her son had joined the Condor mercenary squad because he was a man of principle. Leon closed her eyes and said there was only one problem. She looked at the floor and explained that this squad was too principled. Mikhail looked at her carefully. The mercenaries were riding horses through a gorge. During a mission, they discovered that a demon had appeared in a village isolated from the outside world. The monster loomed over the people, spreading its poison. All the inhabitants were infected. The man raised his head and opened his mouth wide. Without knowing it, the people turned into monsters. Someone approached them. A sword blade flashed in front of the young girl. A demonic eye was reflected in it. The mercenary swung his sword. Blood splashed on the ground. Korea put his hand to his cheek. He looked at the blood and was afraid. Condor had to destroy all the inhabitants of the village. Sitting at the table, Island explained that they thought that these people were beyond saving. But it turned out that not all the inhabitants had become monsters. The girl closed her eyes and explained that it was later discovered that the spread of corruption was slower in small children due to their innate purity. Island lowered her eyebrows and sighing suggested that not everyone knew about this. The guy shuddered. The young man looked away and thought about the fact that the mercenary squad made the best decision under the limited circumstances. The demon controlled the zombified people. In the worst case, the soldiers could miss it, which could lead to an even greater disaster. The woman lowered her gaze and said that they had rushed. Mikhail spread his arms and declared that there are no absolutely correct decisions in the world, so either side is right. The wizard leaned on the table and stood up from his chair. Mikhail put his hand on his belt and said that in order to truly distinguish right from wrong, you need to hear the story from all the participants of what happened. Leon's eyes widened in surprise, and she couldn't understand how she could ask the dead about this. Island's mouth dropped open in shock when she heard that there was a way to do this. The girl jumped up from the table and asked what they were talking about. Mikhail asked if Korea still had the potion he had given to William. A sparkling flask appeared. The woman confirmed this and told him that this potion had alleviated one of his old illnesses. The girl asked if her friend had done something to him. The guy grinned and asked who they thought he was. The young man narrowed his eyes slightly and confirmed his friend's guess. Mother and son stood with their backs to each other. Korea had become a new figure in this timeline, which was very important for the judge of lawlessness. Summoning a flash in his hand, Mikhail thought about why they had to add one interesting function to the potion just in case, and offered to track his location. Several compasses appeared in his hand. The wizard raised his eyebrows in surprise. The woman frowned and asked what was wrong. Leon's eyes widened in surprise when Mikhail asked her to talk to him, or Mordin, or anyone else if they weren't there. The guys opened their mouths in displeasure and asked what was going on here. Mikhail disappeared into thin air and promised to explain everything upon his return. The heroes stood in front of each other at the table. They looked at each other in silence. The swordsman decided to sit on chairs. The friends continued to be silent, already sitting at the table. Mordin pulled out a chair for himself. The sword master suggested discussing MBTI. The guy landed on his feet. He looked up. There was an empty building nearby. There was no one on the streets of the village. The young man put his hand on his belt and realized that he was in an abandoned area in Bakran. Mikhail took a step forward and thought that it was no wonder that he was so hard to find. Some sounds were coming from the dark gateway. The wizard raised his eyebrows and realized that this was no ordinary escape. A dark aura was crawling along the ground. Mikhail concluded that people's shadows do not move on their own. Kiaman sat in the shadows, resting his head on his knees. His hand covered in red vassals had turned black. The boy squinted. His left eye was completely black. The reason for this was demonization. Mikhail approached him. Seth frowned and asked what her friend was going to do. The guy looked at his completely blackened hand and explained that if he left everything as it was, he would inevitably turn into a monster. The girl looked up and realized that he had been abandoned. The young man said that purification would easily stop his transformation. The woman frowned and asked why her friend did nothing in that case. Mikhail lowered the corners of his lips and said the word organizer, imagining the warrior's mother behind him. The wizard thought that this man was blessed with natural talent, and that he really did have the blood of Milium. Mikhail looked up and declared that he was infected. His white robe emitted a bright light. Mikhail realized that this was not a simple demon. Karam lowered his head. A dark aura engulfed his armor. The boy saw a shadow with a face in front of him, and decided that this was how the demon wanted to say that he had a hostage. The young man summoned a weapon in his hand and asked what these threats were for. He hit the boy on the back. Mikhail closed his eyes and said that hitting with a staff was a special pleasure. Set asked if using valuable staff as a club was really their family tradition. The mercenary put his hand to his head. Fortunately, only the demon was damaged. The wizard raised his eyebrows in surprise when he heard a growl in response. Mikhail narrowed his eyes and understood everything. The warrior gritted his teeth. Mikhail noticed how the demon had absorbed most of his body and realized who was behind this damn monster. Meanwhile, on the other side, there was a huge hole in the wall of the house. The boys were sitting at the table. Leon put his hand to his chin and thought about how they had run out of things to talk about. Island took a sip from her mug. The girl put it on the table and decided that she had no right to judge someone for being rude. She smiled tensely and wondered why it bothered her so much. The light glinted on her hair. The woman realized that she had made the first move. Morden closed his eyes and called out to her. Morden winked at her and asked her not to even try to understand his young master because humans cannot stop a natural disaster. With wide eyes, Leon asked what they were talking about and wondered how the servant knew about her feelings. The servant kept a peaceful expression on his face. Island noticed that he had grown a little. The old man's mouth dropped open in surprise and asked if it was really that noticeable. The man placed his hand on his bicep and invited her to touch his muscles. Morden looked around when someone asked what he was doing here. Milium entered the room and asked what was going on. The Holy Sword of the West approached the table and asked why they had come here. The girl said that they had not seen each other for a long time and explained that she was simply following the young master. Getting up from the table, the woman apologized for still not knowing where Kiriam had disappeared to and said that the informant had deceived her. The warrior said that it was not her fault and that they must find her son as soon as possible. Morden lowered his head and said that everything should be fine. The judge of iniquity asked how one could say such a thing when they did not know the state of her child. The servant closed his eyes silently. Suddenly, an explosion was heard behind Milium. A cloud of dust rose into the air. A voice coming from there said that he had teleported to the wrong place. Holding the boy back with magic, Mikhail was surprised that his mother was there too and decided that things would go faster that way. The heroine stared at him in shock. Mikhail raised his hand over the magic ball. Inside it was a mercenary. Seeing him, the Holy Sword of the West widened her eyes and asked where they found him. The guy closed his eyes and said that he understood her feelings and that she needed to hear something first. A force field surrounded the warrior. The filth was growing on his face. The judge of lawlessness frowned in fear. The young man frowned menacingly and asked what had happened to the Condor squad. Raising her hand, the warrior did not know where to start. Mikhail looked away and realized that it was not easy for her to talk about this. The townspeople approached the breach in the wall. It was not the best place to discuss, so Mikhail's decided to move. There was a tall tower in the city. There were other people to share this problem with. The man put his hand on the window. Ishan looked up and thought about how a year or two ago, protecting the borders from demons seemed like a mere fantasy. Ahead was only a dead wasteland. The count frowned and decided that they were ready now, even if they did not have much experience in fighting them. Closing his eyes and imagining a holy night, the man realized that it would be easier if they could get advice from a famous hero. The defender of the West flinched when someone knocked on the door. He looked back. The stranger was clutching a sword in his hand. The knight approached the door and thought about the guards who were supposed to protect the mansion. Ishan grabbed the hilt of the sword and wondered if it was a demon. The man behind him greeted him. The count turned around abruptly and swung his sword. The man's eyes widened and he realized that he had pulled it out instinctively, But this man had no sinister aura. The blade of the sword crashed into the magical barrier. The defender of the West frowned sternly and asked who he was. Mikhail smiled and apologized for the suddenness. Mikhail put his hand to his chest and introduced himself. The knight closed his eyes and said that now he understood everything. Suddenly, he frowned in confusion. Ishan looked up at the guest and asked if this was the same hero in front of him. The answer was affirmative. The guards were lying sleeping on the floor. The man asked why Mikhail was breaking into someone else's house. The knight thoughtfully scratched his beard. The guy lifted Korea's body into the air and said that he came here because he was convinced that His Excellency should also know about the current state of affairs. Hearing that it was all about demons, the defender of the West shuddered tensely. The corruption was eating away at the boy's body. The young man explained that the decay had not yet reached a critical stage and was at the stage where it could be quickly cleansed. Frowning, William asked to do it immediately and promised to repay him for saving her son. Mikhail looked up and asked to tell him about the Condor mercenaries. The judge of iniquity shrugged her shoulders and asked if he really thought the Condor squad had anything to do with her child's decay. The wizard explained that it was just an assumption. The girl looked down. She lowered the corners of her lips and stated that several suspicious events had occurred. The knights walked forward, remembering that Island was next to her. The woman told him that the mercenaries were cautious with her. The warriors stood opposite each other. This was not surprising since most likely they were only guests in this territory. Mikhail narrowed his eyes and decided that this caution was not like the usual. Ishan widened his eyes in confusion and asked if the Condor squad were really connected to demons. Miles raised his sword in front of him. He was a knight who valued honor and who created this group. The Holy Sword of the West narrowed her eyes and admitted that she had been in the mercenary group for over a year. William looked at her colleague and added that she had never seen their leader in person. The guys looked at her tensely. The Count frowned sternly. Mikhail frowned in displeasure. The judge of lawlessness raised her hand over her son and said that Miles seemed to her to be just a busy man until her son ended up like this. Korea was unconscious. The girl looked at him with pity. The woman looked up and asked if the benefactor knew that the squad gave its members new names in order to strengthen their identities as mercenaries. The guy frowned and replied that he knew about it. The leader of the mercenaries was once a knight, so his subordinates are also called a knightly order undercover. The people raised flags and swords. The demands they made had a reason. However, what the Holy Sword of the West said was not this kind of ordinary reason. She frowned and said that these new names seemed strange to her. Blue particles flew around the room. The young man asked what name her son received. William lowered the corners of her lips and answered that his name was Malorn. Mikhail raised his eyebrows in surprise. A smile appeared on his face. The heroes stared at him as the wizard laughed. Mikhail looked up. Bloody writing appeared. It turned out that the names that demons give their subordinates often include the element of elf. Ishan frowned in fear and asked what it meant. Mikhail lowered his head and suggested that this element could work even if its spelling was slightly distorted. Korea was enveloped in blue energy. His name as a mercenary appeared written in blood. The boy turned it over in the air and explained that there was no difference between Elm and Mel. The young man absorbed the dark energy into his hand and realized that it was definitely a deception worthy of the level of demons. The monster jumped out of the mercenary's body. Mikhail summoned golden energy on the tip of his finger and suggested that as soon as Korea received his name, it began to parasitize on him. However, since the name was distorted, his body rotted very slowly. A light arrow pierced a cloud of dark aura. The demon fell to the floor. The Count's eyes widened in shock. The dark energy took the form of a fox. The wizard crouched next to her and explained that there are many symbols representing archdemons. These symbols have levels. The fox in this case is the lower symbol of the archdemon Enoch. Scratching his chin, Morden remembered that this name was mentioned several times in continental history books and told about how this demon corrupted warriors and increased their inferiority complex. Mikhail imagined two burning eyes and thought that before his regression, few managed to cause such chaos as Enoch. Mikhail rose to his feet and added that archdemons can track this symbol. The defender of the West sternly knitted his eyebrows and asked if the monster would really target his territory. The guy nodded silently, raising his hand. Leon suggested that for now they should head to the Condor Squad and asked Ishan to prepare for a possible attack. A voice was heard from behind the door. The Count invited the guest into the office. The guard knelt down on one knee and reported that the soldiers guarding the western wall reported seeing something suspicious. The heroes looked at him carefully, hearing that they had noticed something black and writhing. The man frowned thoughtfully. The knight looked back and said that he needed to go there himself and check the wall. The young man realized that his help might be needed there. The heroes walked along the corridor of the castle. Mikhail silently looked ahead. Milliam approached and addressed him. The girl raised her eyebrows and asked if her comrade did not find the time of the report suspicious. The wizard's mouth fell open in surprise. Smiling, Mikhail replied that he had thought the same thing and realized that her speculations were rational and most likely correct. There was a black rift in the room. Mikhail summoned his staff in his hand. The guy put it on his shoulder and wondered why the demons were so diligent. The young man narrowed his eyes in displeasure. Someone's hand appeared from the rift. Standing back to back with the Judge of Lawlessness, the young man asked her to get ready. The monster's eyes widened. A sly smile hid under the mask. Two demons in wide robes came out of the portal. They headed towards Mikhail. His friends opened their mouths in fear when they saw the villains. The Holy Sword of the West raised her weapon and ordered the enemies to say their names. The monster spread his arms and asked if that was really necessary. The monster raised his index finger and said that they had only one goal: to return to their family. Suddenly, the devil's eyes widened. The villain saw Korea sleeping in the girl's arms and said that he did not feel any energy from him. Mikhail raised his eyebrows and explained that he got rid of her. The monster frowned and asked how that could be because the blessing he gave could not be removed by an ordinary mortal. The wizard spread his arms and said that nothing is perfect. The monster angrily clenched his teeth. The devil furiously knitted his brows and asked his opponent not to be arrogant. He extended his hand forward. The boy was still unconscious, smiling. Mikhail asked the enemy to be honest with him and asked if the demon wanted to make a beautiful entrance. But now that everything went wrong, he felt ashamed. The villain stared at him tensely. He clenched his fist. A huge amount of dark energy burst out of his body. It hung in the air, squinting with disdain. Mikhail noticed that his opponent was thoroughly rotten and asked if he wanted to give up right now. The monster looked up and was outraged by the impudence of an ordinary mortal. The boy raised his eyebrows and asked if he was not once a man. The devil put his hands forward and ordered him to shut up. Dark energy burst forward. It approached Mikhail's. The young man found himself in darkness that enveloped everything. Mikhail looked up. He looked up and realized that it was not darkness but shadows. Many eyes appeared around him. The demon widened his wild eyes and asked if his enemy was frozen in fear as expected of a mortal. The wizard lowered his head. Mikhail smiled and asked his opponent to be quiet. The spell destroyed the darkness and shattered it like glass. The monster fell to the floor. Mikhail asked if he still hadn't realized who was standing in front of him. His body was covered in a bright aura. The monster frowned and realized that he was a hero. The boy extended his hand forward and said that it took him too long to figure it out. The devil grinned. A knife flashed in his hand. The demon pounced on the young man from behind. Mikhail opened his mouth in surprise. A barely noticeable smile appeared on his face. Seth flew forward. The rising storm threw the enemy back. The monster crashed into the wall of the castle, destroying it. The monster frowned angrily and was outraged by the weakness of his comrade. The staff hit him on the head. The devil put his hand in front of him and declared that he would not lose because he was devoted to what he believed in. The staff hit him too. While the beating was going on, William put her sword back in its sheath. The beaten demon raised his hands and asked the enemy to stop. At the moment when the wizard swung the staff, the monster shouted that he remembered some information that might be interesting to him. Mikhail covered his mouth with a magic bandage. Mikhail smiled and said that the interrogation should be quiet. The monster looked at him in fear. Sunlight was shining into the castle through the large windows. A scream was heard. After a few more minutes of beating, the bloody devil lay on the floor, but alive. Mikhail wiped the blood from the staff and explained that demons would not break so easily because their determination was strong. The Judge of Lawlessness thanked him. The guy looked around and realized that based on the fact that the traitors had come here, their assumption was correct. He supposed that there was much to learn from Karaman. The girl nodded tensely. Someone had raised a flag. There was a possibility that the Condor unit had fallen into the hands of the Great Demon. Black hands reached for the fallen flag. A grinning shadow loomed over Miles. The main question was whether the mercenary leader Enoch had succumbed or not. The boy lowered his head. He opened his eyes. The knight looked down guilty. The boys decided to listen to him. The man's body lay in a pool of blood. Miriam grabbed her son's hand. She was broken because her husband had died and forced him into debt. In one hand, the judge of iniquity held her son's hand. In the other, the bones of her dead husband. Kerman had a choice: stay with her or actively help her move on after her father's death. The boy ran forward, but running away was not the right decision. Finding himself behind bars, the mercenary, being too young, could not stand his broken mother. A bloody man lay on the ground. The boy stroked the horse. As time passed, events began to happen that broke his heart. The girl entered the forest with her companion and found her son. The woman smiled when she saw him. People say that time heals all wounds, so she was no longer burdened by the death of her husband. On the ground lay a bloody thorn. It seemed that it was taken out of her heart, and the terrible smell of blood disappeared. The judge of iniquity turned away. Her body was enveloped in dark energy. The boy could also be freed from the burden of his father's death. The darkness thickened. The face of the demon appeared, who wanted Korea to join them. Opening his eyes, the boy saw his mother. The Holy Sword of the West looked back when he asked how she was here. William immediately hugged her son, who had regained consciousness, and said that she came all this way just to find him. Tears appeared in the eyes of the mercenary. The boy tried to push his mother away because a monster lived in his body. Standing nearby, Mikhail told him that they had dealt with that demon. The mercenary looked up and asked who it was. Mikhail put his hand to his chest. Bowing, the boy introduced himself and said that it was the first time he saw him in his right mind. The young man looked up and called himself a hero. Korea clenched his fists and was glad that he had met the one who had crushed the heads of great demons. Mikhail smiled broadly and confirmed that he had some experience in this. Looking at the enthusiastic mercenary, he decided that they would be able to have a good conversation. The wizard pointed at the demons and asked his comrade to look at them. Mikhail removed their hoods. The boy's eyes widened and he named them. Marlin and Baskerville gritted their teeth in displeasure. Mikhail looked down and asked if they really knew each other. The knight explained that they were his seniors in the mercenary corps and probably accepted the rod of their own free will. Hearing that, he left hastily as soon as he realized his situation. The boy bowed his head and asked why it did not occur to him to ask his mother for help. The hand was disintegrating into black particles. Now it was completely healthy. The mercenary narrowed his eyes. Korea looked forward and explained that he did not want to show his rotting body to his mother. Looking up, Mikhail realized what had happened and assumed that no child would want their parents to worry. In the past, the wizard sat next to his dying mother. Closing his eyes, Mikhail said that he understood everything and asked what his comrade remembered from what happened in the mercenary corps. Sunlight was breaking through the windows into the room. More than half of the squad members were lost. The flames engulfed the flags. The squad leader was in prison. It was Vice Captain Ko, whom Miles trusted the most. Closing his eyes, Mikhail realized that before the regression, everything was completely different and decided that they needed to go to the Condor Squad Corps. Leon raised his index finger and asked what they would do with the captured demons that were completely rotten. The guy replied that he was going to use them. Warden frowned and asked what kind of magic the young master would use. Mikhail took a step forward and replied that he would use soul binding. William's eyes widened in shock. Morden frowned in horror. The wizard pointed his staff at the monster's head and thought that he needed information from those who were in cahoots with Enoch, so they would have no choice but to answer all his questions and give up all their secrets. Shadow chains burst out of the monster's chest. Mikhail decided to destroy the bodies of the rotten mercenaries and imprison their souls. The servant looked down and said that it was not an easy spell. Mikhail looked down and confirmed it, and thought that his subordinate did not know that it was just a high spell. A bright flash lit up the staff, holding it in front of him. The boy said that he did not often do this to people, but for traitors who sold their souls, there was no mercy. The face of one of the mercenaries began to crumble. 2 clots of dark energy were tied to the staff. The young man walked down the street of the city, the souls asking to just kill them so that they would not have to be in this state. Without turning around, Mikhail asked who said that they would be able to find peace. The man's eyes turned bloodshot, turning the mercenaries into bound souls. The wizard saw fleeting fragments of their past. Memories of the villains were shown in drops of blood. One of them dealt with innocence in the name of beliefs, and the other hurt people just for fun. Dangling in the air, the ball declared that it had higher motives than its comrade. Gritting his teeth, Mikhail thought about how many people in the Empire suffered in the lost future because of people like him. Seth peeked over his shoulder. Mikhail looked at her, hiding her hands behind her back. The girl praised him for all his efforts and work and asked him not to overexert himself. The guy opened his mouth in surprise. Seth said that he was taking on too much on his own, being an ordinary person. A smile appeared on his face. The young man flicked his girlfriend and replied that everything was fine. The woman put her hands to her head and pouted. Kyle remembered the destroyed world around him and thought about how he now had a future full of possibilities. The wizard resolutely drew his eyebrows together, being sure that there was no chance that everything would collapse, because if it could be destroyed so easily, he would not do anything. Near the outer walls of the county's borders, Mikhail stood on the ramparts. Ishan turned to his guest and listened to his story. The count covered his face with his hand and was disappointed in Miles. Mikhail closed his eyes and explained that they still did not know for sure what happened to the squad captain, and that this problem would be solved when they entered the core. Mikhail looked up and asked what His Excellency thought of the demons. The man raised his hand. He looked away. Outside the walls was only a wasteland. The knight held the decree from the emperor in his hands. The defender of the West stood in front of the window. At the moment, the demons did not seem real to him. Ian placed the document on the table and thought about how he was neither a holy knight nor a devout believer. The warrior walked away from the table, casting his shadow on the floor. The boy frowned and thought that many would react in the same way, since there is always a limit to what people can believe. The young man looked away and decided that he had to let him understand something before leaving this place. A dark aura spread across the desert. Mikhail lowered the corners of his lips and asked the count to listen to him very carefully. Someone was running along the fortress wall. A guard ran up to Mikhail's. The boy saluted his leader. The guard smiled broadly and declared that he had to come immediately as soon as His Excellency called him. The wizard looked at him and noticed his good manners, new armor, and impeccable stance. The knight gave him an uncomprehending look. He could be considered an ideal subordinate. The defender of the West explained that they were just talking with a friend and remembered him. The warrior scratched the back of his head and said that it was a great honor for him. Mikhail extended his hand and said that he was pleased to meet him. Hearing that there was a hero in front of him, the guard shuddered. Mikhail looked up and turned to his colleague. Ison immediately put his hand in his pocket. In his hand was the sign of the Holy Church. At the same moment, the demonized guard pounced on him. His sharp claws were right in front of the count's face. A golden arrow pierced his head. The guy held a smoking staff in front of him. The young man narrowed his eyes and said that demons are very cunning. Mikhail approached his comrade and told him that sometimes they use huge armies to capture their enemies, but most often they aim to divide and destroy humanity from within. The sun's rays reflected off the metal Leon. The demons liked to blend into the crowd. The wizard took the pendant in his hand and explained that this sacred artifact is able to identify demons. Mikhail lowered his hands and reported that the monsters crossed the border of these lands, remaining almost unnoticed. The defender of the West frowned and asked if it was possible that the monsters were already hiding on his territory. Mikhail looked at him silently. The guy opened his mouth and said that his comrade could see for himself. The guard's torn body lay on the ground. The boy explained that this was how demons destroyed their targets. Ishin frowned sternly and remembered what his subordinate had been like. The count turned away and said that he was ashamed that he had almost left this evil monster unfound, as it could have caused irreparable damage. The young man took it in his hands and said that it could still be fixed. Mikhail smiled and declared that His Excellency would definitely cope. The man's eyes widened in amazement. The knight clenched his fists. The squad entrusted everything to the defender of the West and went straight to the Condor squad. The wizard smiled and quickly became convinced that his expectations were not mistaken. The holy metal Leon sparkled. The very next day, Ishan found and burned 5 demons. Leon raised his hand and asked what happened to those treasures. In the end, Mikhail remembered his friend trying to wake him up when he was sleeping to hear the answers to his questions. The boy's mouth dropped open in displeasure when he was called useless. Imagining his comrade inflating like a balloon, Mikhail decided that as long as the knight received support, he would become stronger, so everything was not so bad. The boy looked away. The warrior held a sword in his hand. He probably felt the heaviness that accumulated over time, even if he looked confident outwardly. The young man took his words back. Hearing this, the sword master froze in surprise. Mikhail called him slightly worthy of respect. Leon angrily clenched his fist and asked if his friend really wanted to fight. The wizard looked ahead in surprise. A smirk appeared on his face. Mikhail said that he had no choice and warned that they did not have much time. The knight smiled widely and said that he knew that he could be counted on. Mikhail put his hand on a green bush. Behind him, the demonized mercenaries were hiding. Someone pointed forward and shouted that they had found that woman. The monster bared his teeth and asked how anyone could disrespect the Highland Corps. Island frowned in confusion. Hearing the disgruntled cries, the boy clapped his hands and said that the mercenary had perfectly recited the third-rate villain's text. The young man pushed his friend forward. Mikhail closed his eyes and explained that they would simply watch him deal with the demons on his own using only his swordsmanship. The sword master frowned and reminded him that he had been promised a treasure. Hearing that the treasure meant the blood and sweat he would have to shed, Leon narrowed his eyes in irritation. The monsters rushed to attack. The wizard pointed his index finger forward. Mikhail introduced his comrade as a Pokemon and wished him luck. Gruntled exclamations were heard in the forest. The sun was setting below the horizon. It was dark behind the bars. The chains were attached to the wall. Miles's hands were in shackles. The captain looked away and wondered how much time had passed since his imprisonment. His hands were dry and very thin. The man lowered his eyelids. There was a huge puddle on the floor with red eyes and sharp fangs. Black hands grabbed the knight's clothes. He did not have the strength to hold on to his sanity. The warrior looked up as someone expressed surprise that he had managed to hold out for so long. The man stood on the other side of the bars. He closed his eyes. A burning torch lit the dungeon. Miles asked why his brother was doing all this. The traitor lowered his head. The villain smiled and said that his friend had started it all. The captain leaned forward and said that he had never bothered or ignored him, and that there had to be another reason. He gritted his teeth. The knight scowled furiously and asked how his comrade dared bring demons here and sacrifice innocent people. Ka lowered his head and smirked. The villain looked back and began to laugh uncontrollably. Suddenly, the smile disappeared from his face. The traitor turned away from the prison cell and talked about how if you infect a person, you can easily kill him under the pretext of him being a monster. The demon called it admirable that the sacrifice could be made so easily. The warrior looked at him disappointed. The torch flame illuminated the basement. Miles asked his brother to stop as it was not too late. Keel headed for the exit and declared that there was no point in stopping. He raised his hand and asked his brother to abandon all hope. The torch went out. The traitor walked out of the dungeon. The captain lowered his head and thought about hope. The chains on his hands creaked. The only one who could save him and the Condor squad was Mikhail. The main hero walked forward. The man looked at the floor and asked him to save everyone and stop his brother. The villain grinned maliciously. On the way to the mercenary corps, demonized warriors lay on the ground. Monsters and bandits blocked the path to the Condor Corps. In general, this is a natural consequence of choosing a shortcut. Leon swung his sword. Standing in front of a huge monster, the boy swung his sword several times. He always had to walk ahead of the others. The knight clenched his teeth in fury. Mikhail watched him from afar. Morden raised his eyebrows and concluded that their companion fought fiercely even without using aura. A horse was riding on his back. The boy said that his friend was becoming more and more aware of his savagery. The demon extended his paw forward. Leon's eyes widened. The weapon flashed in his hand. The monster's paw was chopped into small pieces. The monster fell to the ground. The sword master raised his head and let out a battle cry. The boy squinted and thought that this was already becoming his calling card. The full moon shone in the sky. Soup was cooking on the fire. Island handed the bowl to her companion and praised him for his excellent work. Leon looked forward. William was sitting away from everyone. Mikhail approached her and asked what she thought of his comrade. The judge of lawlessness replied that she had heard that he was a child and an exceptional talent who earned the title of the Holy Sword of the next generation. The girl looked up and added that his path had changed. The last time they were in the capital, the woman had noticed his great skills, but he had managed to exceed her expectations. A smile appeared on her face. The knight's future had shattered like glass. He had managed to change his path. The Holy Sword of the West looked away and assumed that the benefactor had influenced this. The wizard silently looked forward. Suddenly, he smiled. Mikhail put his finger on a shard of glass and replied that he did not know for sure. The image of a warrior was formed from the shards. The horse struck the ground with its hoof. The heroes saw the condor corps in the distance. Leon looked around and was surprised that there was only one group of mercenaries in this fortress. William explained that after Miles disappeared, they had been constantly strengthening it. The guys went down to the ground. Seth flew up to her friend and said that they were lucky that the fortress was in such a remote location, as it would ensure that no one would be harmed when the archdemon was destroyed. The monster towered over the forest in Asmodeus' case. The curse was nullified because she was killed in the tomb. Mikhail frowned and suggested that Enoch's true form was unlikely to be here. Aileen raised her hand and asked what their plan was, as they would hardly be able to enter the fortress directly. Hearing that they were going to enter through the front door, the girl narrowed her eyes in disbelief. Korea raised his eyebrows when he was called, smiling. The boy asked if he had acting skills. The sun shone brightly over the fortress. The guard flinched in surprise. Someone appeared in front of him. The boy walked up to the gates of the castle. The guard recognized him as a deserter. The tip of a sword appeared in front of his face. Caden pointed his weapon at his former comrade and called him quite brave for a fugitive. The knight raised his head and said that he would never run away, and explained that he had done his duty completely. His eyes were black. The warrior declared that he had been granted grace. The scoundrel frowned and asked what kind of nonsense this was. Someone approached him. The second in command smiled happily, startling his comrade with his appearance. The blonde closed his eyes and asked his subordinate to return to his position because there was no problem here. Caden tried to object. The man smirked. He narrowed his eyes slightly and repeated his words. The scoundrel looked up at him in fear. At that moment, the guard began to run. The mercenary looked at the fugitive and asked if the boy had accepted this. Try and confirm it. A murky shadow stretching from his feet. Clouds floated across the sky. The deputy commander asked what happened to his comrades who went with him. The boy replied that they caught Mikhail's eye. The villain asked how he managed to survive in that case. The knight closed his eyes and told him that his grace specialized in penetration. A dark aura spread across the ground. Suddenly, it turned into an ordinary shadow, due to which Mikhail could not notice the demon. The warrior raised his white eyes. The man frowned in disbelief, not feeling any traces of dark energy. Korea looked at him sternly. The villain smiled, spreading his arms. The mercenary was surprised that grace could evolve like this and said that with such a level of power, the sacrifice of 2 comrades was quite acceptable. Hearing that the boy had a report, the deputy commander lowered his gaze. The boy raised his head and said that Mikhail came here with him. He pointed his finger at the forest. The knight fell to the ground. Mikhail approached him and praised him for his good work. The warrior looked away. There were Fong shadows behind him. Kareem and asked how much longer he would have to drag them around. Grinning, Marlin and Baskerville begged for death. What was placed in the shadows were their souls. The boy put his hand to his face and pretended to be the one who had fully accepted the rot. The second in command loomed over him. No one would have noticed anything strange if it weren't for Enoch himself. A black haze darted in his eyes. The erasure of soul energies made the knight look like he had been granted a special grace of penetration. The warrior leaned on his hand and said that the enemies could not even think that someone would imitate rot. In the memory, Mikhail raised his hand to imitate the power of a demon. The boy clenched his fist and realized that no one but him could do something like this. Korea added that the deputy commander happily agreed to his proposal. The young man raised his eyebrows and said that it was quite expected. Mikhail took a step forward. The proposal was terribly simple. The boy had to lure his comrade into the mercenaries' fortress. A huge mouth opened in front of him. It slammed shut. The demons were sure that they would be able to kill Mikhail. The wizard asked his friend to continue pretending to be a demon so that they would not have suspicions. The knight nodded. The guys went to the fortress. Mikhail looked away. The mercenaries were watching him carefully from the side. The men were boring into him with their eyes because in front of them was a representative of the Holy Church. Someone clenches their teeth and is displeased. Some of the demons were filled with hatred and enmity. Others simply could not restrain their instincts. Mikhail looked around and said that there were quite a few of them and that it would be difficult to deal with them all. Seth said that it was very creepy here. A tall tower stood ahead. Entering, Karen said that the second in command was in the room at the end of the hall. Raising his eyebrows, the boy said that they would talk to him themselves and asked if everything was clear to everyone. Leon put his hands behind his head. Morden closed his eyes. William lowered her head and said that they would check everything themselves. Island shrugged and added that they needed to remain unnoticed. The boy smiled and said that they would have to return here at the appointed time. The youth nodded approvingly. Mikhail raised his hands and asked them to disperse. The boys evaporated into thin air, leaving behind a cloud of dust. The doors were closed. The knight looked down. The wizard shuddered when the warrior asked if the demons had brainwashed the second in command despite his willpower. Mikhail looked back and answered in the negative. Korea lowered his head in disappointment. Mikhail turned to him and said that he understood that he did not want to believe it, but the fact remains a fact and it should not be denied. The guy sternly knitted his eyebrows and thought that his friend's position regarding the deputy was quite complicated. The demonized man extended his hand forward. The scoundrel was definitely a traitor to the Condor Corps. In the past, the mercenary standing next to Miles also extended his hand, being the one who saved the boy from the sewer rats. The young man closed his eyes and explained that there was no need for such emotions now and that they needed to focus. Mikhail looked up when he heard a loud bang. The knight raised his hand. He brought his hands to his face and sighed. The warrior turned around and said that he was ready to go. There were marks from blows on his face. The wizard opened his mouth in surprise. A kind smile appeared on his face. Mikhail walked forward and concluded that his help was not needed. Mikhail put his hands to the doors. Under his pressure, they opened. The deputy commander smiled broadly. The man folded his hands behind his back and greeted Mikhail. The guy covered his eyes with his hand because the room was brightly lit. The sun's rays penetrate the hall through the windows. The young man squinted and assumed that this was the enemy's way of showing that he had no connection with demons. Mikhail smiled with difficulty. The demon frowned and asked what was wrong with him. The wizard spread his arms and said that it was too bright in here. The hawk flapped its wings. The mercenary asked what brought the guest here. The bird turned its head. Mikhail answered that he had received a revelation. The deputy commander closed his eyes and asked his subordinate to leave them alone. Korea put his hand to his chest and obeyed him. The heroes stood opposite each other. The man asked what kind of revelation it was. Mikhail closed his eyes and answered that there was nothing special in it. The guy looked up and asked permission to find out where Miles was. The villain smiled broadly and replied that the commander had temporarily retired. Putting his hand to his chin, the young man explained that this enlightenment concerned him directly, and added that he would like to inform him personally. Seth carefully flew behind the enemy. The villain said that if this was related to him, then he had even more reasons to know about it since he was a member of his family. The girl brought her hand to her mouth and whispered that she was right. Mikhail wiped his mouth with his hand. The wizard spread his arms and decided that it would be right to convey the revelation to his deputy. Mikhail approached him and said that this revelation was very simple. The great hawk plucked small feathers. Then the bird spread its wings and soared high into the sky. Mikhail assumed that he removed all the unnecessary feathers. A flock of birds flew past the window. The man closed his eyes and asked what it meant. The guy frowned and replied that it could be interpreted in any way because the gods loved vague expressions. The mercenary clenched his fist. Still smiling, the villain decided that it was not difficult to guess who the feathers were. The young man closed his eyes and confirmed this. The feathers fell to the floor. Mikhail asked whose side would be the feathers that the hawk got rid of. There were closed doors ahead. The villain's cloak fluttered in the wind. Without turning around, the deputy commander called his subordinate to him. Korea stepped forward, standing with his back to him. The man said that Mikhail had already noticed that the Condor squad was blessed. The boy replied that he already knew this. The villain turned around and decided to give his comrade a chance to live this life as a part of him. The knight put his hand to his chest and bowed. The mercenary asked him to gain Mikhail's trust and detain him here. The villain grinned and said that even Mikhail, who destroyed 2 great demons, would not be able to cope with Enoch. His eyes turned black. Miles was drowning in black liquid. The vassal would be ready soon. The warrior rolled his black eyes. The second in command declared that they were waiting for a full revival of the great demon. The man raised his hand. There was a red mark under his desk. The villain smiled broadly and added that he would stand at the forefront of this revival. Mikhail crossed his arms over his chest. His team stood in front of him. Mikhail asked what they had managed to find. Morden closed his eyes and explained that the demons hid them very skillfully, but they were able to detect the presence of devilish marks that affect those who were marked with a name. Niam looked back and added that they had also identified places with an unusually large number of people, but did not advance further since they did not know what cunning traps could be hidden there. Looking away, the guy called it a wise decision and said that he had good and bad news. Leon clenched his fist and said that he wanted to hear the good news first. The boy folded his arms and told them that during their conversation with the second in command, they had roughly figured out where Miles was being held. The boy said that it was simply wonderful and asked what the bad news was. Mikhail closed his eyes and explained that if they were unlucky, Enoch himself would come here. His comrades frowned tensely. The sword master looked at his comrade and asked what this meant. The sky above the city turned orange. The wizard said that he was more evil than they expected. The knight raised his hand and asked him to stop. Leon put his hand to his forehead and asked if Enoch was not on the same level as Asmodeus, whom they had already fought. Mikhail stated that at the moment he felt that this demon was much stronger. Leon opened his mouth wide and expressed his indignation. The judge of lawlessness lowered her head and asked why the great demon would interfere in this directly. Mikhail lowered the corners of his lips and talked about the brand of the Lord. In the darkness appeared the sign that the great demon gave to several of his cherished followers. Seth looked under the table. The girls saw the same sign there. Eileen raised her eyebrows and realized that everything was not as smooth as they thought. The guy raised his index finger and said that there was something else. The young man imagined the menacing look of the second in command and said that the enemies wanted to use Miles as a vassal for Enoch. Morden's eyes widened in shock and asked what that meant. The commander was chained to the wall. The man looked up, his eyes dimmed. The face of the devil appeared before him. Morden asked if the enemy really wanted to use him for rebirth. The guys threw up their hands, not understanding how to save their comrades so that no one would notice. Mikhail grinned and asked why it was complicated. The friends stared at him in surprise. The wizard imagined the soul of the man being sucked into the vassal and decided that once the purification was complete, Miles would become the vassal, but they could try to cleanse him, even if it took too long. The urn cracked. Mikhail smiled slightly and suggested making him go berserk. The black energy sucked the commander's body into itself. The man lowered his head and began to breathe heavily. His hands trembled. The warrior asked if this was really how his end would be and noticed that his senses had already weakened. A dark whirlpool appeared in front of him. A voice urged him to surrender. Enoch bared his fangs and said that it would make him feel better. The knight raised his head and thought that he had no more hope. He narrowed his eyes and suggested that surrendering now might be the only way out. Pieces of stone fell from the ceiling. A small hole appeared there. Mott's head appeared from it. A bright light illuminated Miles's exhausted face. The fairy flew up to him. The moth raised a finger and declared that his fists would dig up the sky. The man looked at him and asked what the fairy was doing here. The commander's eyes widened when he heard Mikhail give him a message. The pixie smiled. The warrior imagined Mikhail in armor and decided that there was still hope. The knight smiled and asked what Mikhail said. The moth closed his eyes. The fairy held a finger forward and said the word despair. The prisoner stared at him in horror. Miles hung his head in disappointment. The guys decided that turning him into a berserker mode was too dangerous. Mikhail raised his eyebrows and suggested that they think about it. Mikhail imagined the black liquid filling the commander and explained that in order to make a perfect vassal, the process must be 100% complete. The man's body cracked. The guy suggested making an imperfect vassal out of it. The friends frowned tensely. The young man decided that instead of stopping Enoch, they should lure him into an imperfect body. Leon raised his eyebrows and asked what would happen to him. Then Mikhail looked away and suggested thinking about it later. Island thoughtfully put her hand to her chin. The wizard said that they could purify their comrade at any time if they defeated Enoch inside him. The girl looked up and asked if they really would have to fight Miles himself. Mikhail winked at her and said that this is what is called destruction in the name of creation. His comrades stared at him in silence. The question of who the real demon was swirling around their bright heads. Raising his hand, Mikhail asked them not to worry and said that he had already sent someone to inform them of the current situation. Madia was circling around the commander. The boy explained that their friend should already know about everything. The young man smiled and suggested that they approach this with all seriousness. Kyle glanced at his friends and asked if they would crawl into the enemy's lair. The heroes met in the forest. Korea explained that if they took this path, they could reach the deputy commander. The boy added that there was no way they could lose in that area. The wizard closed his eyes and said that everything would be fine. The knight narrowed his eyes worriedly. Mikhail said that what they said did not matter at all. The warrior looked at his staff and replied that he was not worried. Mikhail looked away as the mercenary admired his weapon that had crushed countless demons. Seth asked what this place was. There was a force field ahead. The boy entered it. Purple particles flickered around him. The young man looked away. The space under his hand began to change. Looking at the tree, Mikhail realized that this was the magic of the 8th Circle and found it no wonder that the enemies were so confident in their victory. The second in command approached him and greeted him. Rolling his eyes, the wizard said that he knew he needed help and asked what was wrong. Miriaman's eyes turned black. The boy swung his dagger to hit his friend. Blood splattered onto the ground. It gushed from Mikhail's mouth. Mikhail grabbed his wound and asked why his comrade did this. His body collapsed to the ground. The man smirked. The villain raised his head and laughed loudly. The knight looked at him silently. He held a dagger in his hands. The mercenary said that even a great hero could not see through people's hearts. The blade of the knife sparkled. It turned out that this weapon given by Enoch gives enemies a merciless death. The villain said that even a hero cannot escape the death decreed by the Great Lord. The guy squinted and realized that this was the death that the archdemon had been forging for centuries. The young man opened his mouth wide and thanked his opponent. At that moment, Mikhail rose to his feet. The deputy commander asked what this meant. The wizard wiped the blood from his face and was surprised that the enemy was caught so easily. The warrior could not believe that they had succeeded. The man's black eyes widened and said that it was impossible since he saw that his subordinate had become one of them. Mikhail took the demon's soul from his comrade and explained that this was also a trick. The villain frowned in confusion and asked if he had been tricked. The mercenary clenched his teeth in anger. The villain opened his mouth wide and said that it was too late. The armored men were moving forward. The second in command explained that he had called all his comrades to prepare for any unforeseen outcome. The army of the possessed was approaching. Because of the barrier, the owners of divine power would not be able to escape so easily. Mikhail looked down. The man called him a cornered rat. The boy lowered the corners of his lips and asked what kind of empty boasting this was. At that moment, an explosion was heard in the forest and a cloud of smoke rose into the sky. The villain looked up. He raised his eyebrows and asked what happened to the victim. The young man raised his hand and said that he did the same as his enemy. The seal on his wrist caught fire. Mikhail said that he gave the enemy despair and made an opportunity out of it. The wizard narrowed his eyes in disdain and explained that this was karma that must be meekly accepted. A bright flash appeared in the sky. A powerful wave of energy fell to the ground. Streams of wind enveloped the villain. A black silhouette appeared in a cloud of smoke. William's hair fluttered in the wind. She had a menacing look. Clenched his teeth when the labyrinth was activated. He knew who would appear now. William Arsarin's figure seemed to emerge from the fog. Korea looked at his mother with pain when she addressed him. The young man's eyes widened when the warrior said that she knew that she would not suit him as a judge. A figure of his mother flashed before his mind's eye in those years when he was a child. The boy looked at her again. He extended his hand to the woman. Grabbing her sleeve, the young man said that now he understood everything. The warrior turned around when her son asked her to go with him. She could not refuse him. Kyle's face was pleased when the holy sword told him to do what he had to do, and they would make a fair judgment, and he left everything to them. Blackness crept across the deputy commander's face. Turning into a demonic form, he asked where Mikhail was going. William raised her sword and noted that the man had finally abandoned the idea of turning into a human. The demon's eyes lit up. The crowd under his command rushed into battle when they heard the order to kill everyone present. The blade in the woman's hands lit up, and she announced that she would pass judgment on the traitor. Her fingers tightened their grip. The warrior's hair shook when she summoned a meteor. Many energy balls flew down from a cloud of magic high in the sky. The warriors under the demon screamed. The meteor fell on their ranks, knocking them off their feet. At the same time, in the Condor fortress, the paving stones in the courtyard flew to the sides, and someone screamed about despair. First, a clawed hand appeared from the pit, clinging to the stones. Then, legs stepped onto the platform, embraced by demonic power. Miles, captured by the demon, finally got out of the dungeon. But the real commander hovered above the fortress and tried to understand what was happening. Looking down at his own body, he asked the fairy if he was really dead. The little girl flew closer to his face and answered that it was not so. Looking at his translucent palms, the man was afraid that his mind was collapsing. So, he separated from the body, after which he clarified whether the current state would protect his personality. Looking down in despair, he tried to understand if there was another way to stop his active body. But then, 2 fighters came out to meet the demon. The commander shuddered, recognizing Twilight and 2 children and those who had come. Liam and Eileen, accompanied by Morden, approached the place where the enemy had appeared, and the young man was even glad that the demon had finally crawled out. Looking at the determined faces of the children, Enoch thought that they were quite talented. Morden, standing behind them, raised his head. He pushed off the ground with his feet. Concentrating his powers on the captured one, he launched a modified type of Twilight and sent destructive force at the enemy. The demon extended his hand, creating a blade from his dark magic. With its help, he managed to repel the enemy's attack, causing him to fly to the side. But Enoch himself also barely stayed on his feet, although he said out loud that this was not enough. He looked at the hand of the captured body and tried to understand why it was so fragile that it could not even recover, not to mention its unique skills. Liam took advantage of the enemy's confusion and rushed towards him with a blade, and this caught the demon by surprise. While he was trying to repel the guy's attack, Island came up from behind, and when the demon turned around, he saw her satisfied face. The blade almost fell out of the hand of the captured Miles. The blows from both sides flew one after another, and Enoch was sure that these 2 would die from just one swing of his sword. But both the boy and the girl were smiling, and the creature of darkness did not understand why. The commander, watching from above with concern, could not help but admit that the boys were strong. But then he closed his eyes and added that it was still not enough. A flash of flame scattered Mikhail's, and they barely managed to jump back. The demon expressed regret. Such people met on his path from time to time. Liam raised his blade when the enemy added that even Mikhail, who killed 2 lords, was the same. The eyes of the creature of darkness burned brighter when he screamed that he would destroy them. The possessed one looked at the fighters, thinking out loud what he would do with them first. He raised his hand and it glowed. Enoch's magic cut through the pavement right towards Leon, and he declared that the youngest would go first. Morden raised his hand sharply, shouting the boy's name. The magical blow pierced the wall of the fortress in 3 places. Miles, hovering above the battlefield, was scared. He fell to his knees and muttered that his body would not withstand such a fierce battle. The commander closed his eyes and added that he could not do this anymore. The fairy patted him on the shoulder and asked him not to worry. She lay on his back and said that they were there. The man did not understand what the little girl was talking about. The creature smiled. A bright flash of light illuminated Liam, who had disappeared into the smoke. He looked at his hands in surprise. The wind swayed the white cloak and its wearer walked on the clouds. Mikhail came out to the allies. Enoch looked at the destroyed wall of the fortress. He took a couple of steps back and decided to run away from here. Visibly panicking, he admitted that this body was excellent, and if he managed to keep it in this form, then everything should be fine. But then he felt a familiar energy. The young man, engulfed in light, continued to look at his hands. When Mikhail's voice said that everything was exactly as the demon thought with a satisfied smile, Mikhail noted that he was recognized immediately, It seemed that he was becoming known to the dark forces as well. The Archmage's expression changed to a dangerous one, and he added that in that case, Enoch had to hide like the others. The flames of darkness around the possessed one hummed when the savior of humanity asked why he so desperately wanted to stand out from the crowd. The enemy's face distorted with anger, and he rushed at the young man, demanding that he shut up. But the Archmage's face was calm, and he used a massive attraction, causing the magic pillar to rise into the air, breaking the pavement stone. Watching the dust settle, Mikhail offered his opponent to surrender. He was not ready yet. The possessed one rose from the ground. He rubbed his face with his hand. The hand of the captured body trembled when Enoch asked how Mikhail dared. The face of the creature of darkness reflected his rage. He screamed, "How dare this inferior man!" Miles' body rose to his feet, spreading dark power around him. The hero, who rose into the air, suddenly felt a strange demonic energy. While the possessed one tried to stand up straight, the young man noticed that it was not hostile. A satisfied grin appeared on Mikhail's face. "Just look at this demon." Seth appeared over Mikhail's shoulder, clenching her fists, and he asked his friend if she could reveal her true form. The girl answered in the affirmative. At this time, the creature of darkness jumped from the bridge up. His face expressed complete self-confidence as he approached the warrior, but in the end, he slipped past Mikhail. At that moment when Seth acquired her true form behind Mikhail, he noticed that Enoch pretended to be strong but always prepared for victory. The girl released the fortress storm from her palms. When Mikhail asked her to do so, the storm she used closed the passage from both the inside and outside. The possessed was swirled in a green whirlwind. Enoch, who lacked physical form, would be able to pass. The wind hit the foot of the broken wall of the fortress. The demon was unlikely to so easily give up the body that he had prepared for so long and carefully. The creature of darkness rose with difficulty from the broken pavement. With a displeased look, the possessed turned around and called Seth a pathetic girl. She smiled contentedly, and when asked not to say that she had been accumulating strength all this time, she replied that she was still a creature at the level of an apostle, and was not going to repeat her mistakes. Mikhail, hovering in the air, said that the demon had two options, demanded that Sir Miles be voluntarily released, after which he smiled contentedly and threatened that he would be beaten to death, and the captured body would still be released. But then Enoch put his clawed paw on the commander's chest and said that he could destroy this body. Mikhail looked at him with pity when the question was asked if they wanted to allow this. He closed his eyes and said that it was possible. Then he abruptly descended to the ground to the enemy, realizing that since he took the body hostage, it meant that he had nothing left. It was clearly a bluff. Mikhail swung his hand and added that if he had not dealt with him, the possessed one would have tried to attack in response. Surprise was reflected in his eyes when he heard that the answer was wrong. He looked down and saw that a fairy had sat on his shoulder, who said that there was nothing here that she should stop. Her eyes lit up when the little one ordered the fairy's shackles to flare up. Scarlet vines began to spread across the possessed one's body. They entwined the entire body, not allowing him to move. Enoch twitched in fear in the bonds. A flash of dark light spread around him, and he asked loudly, "Do they really think that this will hold him?" A magic staff appeared in Mikhail's hands, and he thought that he was right. No matter how special the fairy was, it was impossible to completely seal the great demon, but 1 or 2 seconds that were needed to remove the shackles were enough for him. With these words, Mikhail swung the staff at the enemy. A bright flash of light rushed from the magician forward. A part of the split pavement fell right on the possessed one. While he was trying to drop it on himself again, Mikhail asked how long he was going to destroy himself in order to destroy the body. More and more anger appeared on the demon's face while Mikhail continued to speak. Because his plan would not work, he asked where the strength came from to injure himself, and he himself answered that from the arms and legs. The young man took a step forward. With madness in his eyes, the warrior promised to break all the possessed man's limbs and later heal him. It's that simple. From this statement, sincere fear appeared on the enemy's face. The first blow of the holy destroyer hit the face of the captured body. The demon barely had time to call Mikhail crazy. Shaking his head after the blow, the creature of darkness was indignant that these were not even his limbs. Trying to get to his feet, the demon demanded that if he was a hero, he should behave appropriately. The young man looked at the enemy with skepticism. after which he dealt a strong blow, demanding that he shut up and emphasizing that he had chosen the path of a hero. With malice in his gaze, the demon said that Mikhail was not a hero. But the magic gag did not let him finish. Continuing to beat the possessed man with a staff so that he was soon covered in blood, he repeated with each blow that no matter what, he was a hero and would decide for himself how to behave. At some point, Mikhail stopped and called his actions cruel. And Enoch did not give up even after something like that. Is this really how great demons behave? Looking at the possessed one, trembling under his feet, the guy asked if he wanted to receive another blow of holy destruction. And at that moment, a tear appeared in the eyes of the creature of darkness. Mikhail stared at this in shock, not understanding what was flowing from his enemy's eyes. He even lowered his staff and asked not to tell him that the possessed one was crying. The demon smiled triumphantly because everything was going well at first. It was easy to lure the Deputy Commander Condor Keel into a trap. At that moment, the warrior's face was consumed by madness. His inferiority complex because of his brother led to the fact that as soon as the deputy was shown the opportunity to surpass the commander, he immediately surrendered. A massive armed group called Condor was about to fall into his hands. Miles' empty eyes meant complete control over the master's body, and Enoch would not need to return his name, as he thought. Kyle's laughter seems creepy. It brought genuine fear to the possessed commander's face. He looked at the creepy smile, and realized that his plans were ruined by meeting this guy. Tears streamed down his cheeks in the captured body as the demon wondered why this particular mage was considered a hero. Remembering the death of Asmodeus after Mikhail defeated him in a battle of wits, Enoch thought that Mikhail would be a very rational being. Blood dripped onto the ground and the demon thought that his opponent was cruel, and much more insidious than he thought. Continuing to cry, the possessed one realized that for the first time in his life, he felt fear of humanity. Trying to raise the captured commander with a broken arm, he realized that he was wrong because now he could not escape with this body. Somehow assuming a sitting position, Enoch said that this time Mikhail won, but he would not be able to destroy him. Menacingly looking at the mage, the creature of darkness promised that he would return and show how pathetic his enemy was. The guy let out a tired breath and was surprised that the demon was still there because he was already starting to fall asleep from boredom. The possessed man froze in shock because the savior of humanity asked if he wanted another portion of blows. The demon flew out of the commander's body in a thin stream, saying that he was leaving. Miles, who had been watching this whole scene, was somewhat shocked by what had happened. The young man put his hands on the commander's chest, completely healing him from the wounds he had received. While the others were gathering closer, he explained that he had completely restored his body before he finally returned to normal. Everything should be fine with his health. The man let out a tired breath and Mikhail added that he would not be able to take away the consequences of what had happened in the form of terrible fatigue. The commander's gaze was filled with sadness. He stood up and bowed to his savior, thanking him for his help. The warrior shook the young man's hand and acknowledged that he had done a great service, although the latter considered it an exaggeration. Then Mikhail noticed that the commander's shoulders were shaking. His fingers were trembling and even Seth noticed it. The man's face was covered in sweat while the mage explained that after the beatings his body had endured, this was normal. After that, the young man saw that Miles's gaze was directed at his staff. He quickly put the weapon in his bag, admitting that he had not taken this into account, but the commander apologized for this. The man lowered his head. Mikhail looked away and said that regarding the deputy commander, he believed that Lady Milliam had already dealt with him. The commander did not immediately raise his eyes to his savior, but when he remarked that if he still worried about his younger brother, then it would be a pitiful sight, but in response, he heard no. The young man looked at him questioningly and heard that his brother's betrayal was simply terrible for him. Miles clenched his fist and said that he knew better than anyone when to cut ties. Mikhail smiled, then closed his eyes. He understood everything and was going to respect someone else's decision. So, he asked Morden to bring what he had said earlier. Handing the knight his cloak, he offered to go with him. Looking at the man with respect, he addressed him by his full rank. Near the circle of stones, the last blade fell to the ground, leaving a path of bodies behind them. Mother and son pointed their swords at the traitor Keel because only he remained. The traitor was shaking with anger when they demanded that he surrender. At that moment, the demon's seal of mercy disappeared from the neck of the former deputy. He froze in fear because this meant the worst. Korea lowered his sword when the man began to mutter that this could not be and Enoch could not lose. The traitor stopped when he was attracted by the young man's voice. With pain in his eyes, he asked if the deputy commander really sold his soul to the devil for this. Ku's eyes widened. He extended his hand to the boy and said that he thought he would understand what it was like to always be dragged behind and always have to watch the back of the one walking in front of him. The image of his brother's back flashed before the man's mind's eye. His face reflected anger when he said that even when his parents were dying, they did not expect anything from him. He remembered the moment of his mother's death, but until the very end, everything revolved around Miles. They only called his brother. Remembering all the insults, the traitor added that they did not notice him. Still angry, he finished his speech by saying that it was like this from the very beginning and until the very end. Korea looked away. 'Cause someone who shared his hatred, albeit a little differently, so he thought he would understand. The man lowered his head and was about to say something else when he heard a familiar voice. Mikhail was rushing to the scene, helping the Condor commander walk. The brothers' eyes met. The traitor began to laugh. Mikhail let go of the rescued man while his younger brother laughed that he had finally appeared. When the commander took a few steps forward, Ka asked if he had come to scold him. He hadn't even noticed that the commander had pulled out his sword when he said that he didn't want to listen to all this nonsense. And the traitor's face reflected horror when Miles said that he had come to him not as a younger brother but as a deputy commander. The commander's back was straight when he was reminded that the third rule of the Condor Article 1 stated that the punishment for committing cruel crimes was death. Raising the blade, he added that only the commander could punish the deputy commander. Straightening the blades, the man declared that he had to kill his brother. And looking at him with a sad look, he finished that they themselves had created these rules. Mikhail watched as Miles swung his sword, although his hands were shaking. He squinted, not knowing whether it was because the sword was heavy for him, or maybe because of the emotional shock. Kyle closed his eyes, admitting that he still could not understand. Keel looked at the commander. Then he fell to his knees in front of him, thinking that this was what his brother was like, the one who carried a heavy burden on himself, and he watched it from the sideline. It began to rain. Lowering his head, the traitor told the commander that he surrendered because he had to follow the rules. Closing his eyes, he thought that maybe there was another way, and he wanted to go back to the past, but then said that it was useless to think about it now. Wet hair hid the commander's eyes at that moment when he realized that what was done could not be undone. Rain flowed down the warrior's face, and it became clear that the past should remain in the past. He closed his eyes, preparing to meet his punishment with dignity. The blade of the sword flashed in the sun, and the next moment, blood splashed. The traitor only had time to hope that in the next life, they would again be brothers. The sun in the sky was shining brightly all around. The incident in Condor was sorted out, and it was finally time to go. Miles smiled warmly and said that he wanted to express his gratitude once again. Mikhail smiled back and said that there was no need to do that because he had only done his job. He looked down and suddenly asked if he really planned to keep it like that. In the knight's left hand lay a staff, the blue stone, and it shone brightly in the sun. It was not a red-painted cane, but a real staff. Mikhail stared at it, saying to himself that it was a copy of his staff. Miles, laughing, raised it higher. He closed his eyes and remembered how Mikhail had beaten him up badly that day, after which he said that he had realized something then. You shouldn't always rely on your sword. Hearing this, the guy raised his eyebrows in confusion and said that perhaps he should think about it again, to which he laughed and added that he was just joking. Mikhail silently looked at the man. After a short pause, he smiled widely and said, "One more step towards a brighter future," to which Set pulled his cheek and told him to stop overthinking. Miles suddenly raised his staff to the sky and exclaimed that with it he could defeat any demon, to which Mikhail quietly replied, "Of course," after which he added that he understood the feeling of hatred after what happened, but he should not let himself drown in it. Hearing this, the man twitched. Mikhail pointed his finger to his temple and said, "Let the heart boil with feelings, but decisions must be made with a cool head." After which he asked if the knight understood what he was talking about. Miles closed his eyes and firmly answered that he understood. Having said this, he took his sword out of its sheath. His cloak fluttered in the wind. The man knelt down and asked Mikhail to continue on his way. His subordinates behind him also knelt down, William's son did the same as his comrades, and their leader added wherever he met them. Raising his head, Miles finished. They will always help him. Mikhail looked at all of them with surprise in his eyes. Suddenly, a smile appeared on his face, after which he said that it was an honor for him. After some time, he and his comrades left Condor when suddenly a familiar voice asked them if they were leaving, which made Mikhail turn around in surprise. William and Island were watching them from behind a tree. Mikhail got off his horse and asked in response, "Didn't they stay with Sir Karaman?" Karaman decided to stay with the mercenary group, so he thought that Milliam would do the same. But the Sword Master closed her eyes and answered, "No," adding that she decided to go on a journey. Having said this, she slowly opened her eyes. She remembered her son following her, and saying that he understood everything now. Leaving her memories, the girl took her hand and said that he was already an adult. He did not need to stay near his parents. Mikhail silently looked at her and after a short pause suddenly said, "So she was finally letting him go," smiled warmly and replied that it took her time to realize everything. Lowering her gaze, she added that the child supported her life, of course, did not realize the sins that fettered him. She left her iron mask and her son had long understood everything. William looked at the interlocutor, saying that she planned to continue the activities of the judge, although she would have to rethink some things. Lost in thought, Mikhail imagined a teacher traveling the world, catching criminals and demons, after which he smiled broadly, answering, "Sounds exciting." Putting her hand on Island's shoulder, Milliam said with a smile that she would entrust her student. The girl's face changed, turning away in horror. Mikhail and Leon frowned in confusion, asking why this was so. Island turned to the teacher in confusion. Without turning around, William replied that she did not need to take on the responsibility of being a judge, and they agreed that the girl would only learn how to wield the sword, after which Island widened her eyes, indignantly shouting that she was not ready yet. The judge of lawlessness extended her hand forward, saying that she had already understood the essence of her meteor, and now she lacked practice in the real world. Putting her hand on the head of the shocked alien, she added that they would meet again, and then she would teach her student the next steps. Closing her eyes, she told the girl to work hard until then with a smile. With her brows drawn together, Island looked forward in confusion. Covering her eyes with her hands, she bowed her head, trying to hide her tears. Leon and Morden covered their faces with handkerchiefs, tearfully, saying that it was a very heartbreaking farewell scene. Suddenly, Mikhail raised his hand. Looking at Milliam, the boy said that he did not tell her that he would accompany her. Leon and Morden became angry, perplexed, asking if he was serious, while Mikhail stood unmoved, wondering what was wrong. Coldly turning away, the judge of lawlessness replied that her student was quite a valuable ally. Closing his eyes, Mikhail replied that he did not mind taking Island with him. Looking up, he said that caring for someone comes with experience, when suddenly Seth rolled her eyes, asking him not to say. Suddenly, the boy made a circle with his fingers. Smiling maliciously, he asked how much the girl was willing to pay. Milliam thought, putting her hand to her chin. Looking up, she said that it would be strange to entrust Island to the hands of a great hero without paying anything. Mikhail suddenly extended his hand forward, holding some kind of artifact on it. Looking up at Milliam, he asked if this was the elixir of the Beast King, to which the judge of lawlessness nodded, answering that the guy recognized it. Lost in his memories, Mikhail thought that of course he recognized it because the Beast King and his old comrade had such an elixir. Looking forward, William said that once while working as a judge, she saved a group of beast men. She watched Mikhail, adding that as it turned out, there was one with noble blood among them, and he gave her this elixir as a gift. Suddenly she asked if this was not enough, to which Mikhail pursed his lips, answering that he was simply surprised by her generosity. Squeezing the elixir in his hands, the guy said that he accepted it. Smiling, William replied that she then handed the student over to him, and if he needed anything, he could contact her. Walking forward, she suddenly stopped. Without turning around, the judge of lawlessness said that she would look forward to his exploits. The guys climbed onto their horses. Leon looked ahead, asking where they were going now because he was just following Mikhail. Without looking at him, Mikhail answered his house when suddenly the count closed his eyes. Turning around, he said that he was leaving when suddenly the guy grabbed his head, answering that they would go together. Changing his face, Leon screamed in horror that this was just ridiculous. after which he asked why they had to walk so much to get to his house. Closing his eyes, Mikhail answered that there were many reasons. Raising his hand, he said that from now on he planned to do one thing that his father would definitely not like. Turning around, he added with a smile that he needed a shield. Looking at the guy said that at a critical moment they would all become one team because that's what good comrades do. Island looked at Mikhail, saying that he called them shields, not comrades. Mikhail suddenly raised his head with his eyes closed. He opened his eyes abruptly looking at the sky. Mikhail said that the weather was fine outside when suddenly the guys frowned, shouting for him to at least refute what he said. The central meeting hall of the archdemon's pandemonium. Inside there were 4 torches with purple flames burning. Suddenly the flame of one of them became brighter, and a voice was heard from it saying that only 5 lords remained and one of them had already suffered a miserable defeat. Hearing this, the fire of the second torch became stronger, and the voice from there asked discontentedly, "What the hell? Where did that hero come from?" Because they had never encountered such a thing before. The voice from the first brightly burning torch, laughing, asked if someone like him, who could not even find his own real name, had the right to talk about this hero at all. Hearing this, the flame of the second torch slightly died down. Suddenly, the torch with the red flame ordered everyone to be silent. Its flame was higher and brighter than all the others, and it said that the situation had changed. They did not have time to quarrel with each other. The first torch laughed and said that the elder was right. On the other side was Belfiger, who smiled widely and asked if it would not be better to finish off Mikhail right now. The face of Mikhail appeared in the center of Pandemonium's table, and the demon added that she felt that they needed to deal with him before he became even stronger. Then the torch with an equally low flame asked what if they failed. Belfiger stood in front of the mirror from which the voice of her comrade said that all his preparations would destroy his plans with their own hands, and then asked her if she could handle it. Belfiger had large horns on her head, but she remained silent. Suddenly a large red flame appeared, and a voice from it quietly said, "Soon." Of all the torches, only 2 were not burning, and the elder continued to say that Mikhail would face chaos that he had never seen before, chaos that could not be controlled. The world would be enveloped by a plague. Dark magical energy began to absorb Mikhail's face. One of the purple torches looked down at the floor and said in his head that the elder only said this with such confidence when the situation was truly terrible, adding that it was worth believing something really terrible was coming. Horror appeared in his eyes when he remembered how Mikhail swung his staff and said with a crazy smile on his face to break his arms and legs, leaving the memories. His flame became smaller, and he asked himself if the elder was confident in his actions. Some time passed. The territory of the Walpurgis family. The bright sun illuminated a huge castle. Mikhail descended to the ground. Looking at his house, he said with a smile on his face that he had not been here for 2 years, which made him feel nostalgic. His comrades lowered their heads tiredly and quietly said they had finally arrived. Leon with a pitiful frown looked at his friend and said that he had heard that he was planning something. After which he asked what exactly he wanted to do. Mikhail raised his eyebrows and coldly replied, "Nothing special," which made the guy furiously raise his hands and shout, asking who he was trying to tell because every time he said nothing special, it turned into a disaster. Mikhail, hearing this, grinned and said that this is why he hates people who understand him at a glance. Without moving from his seat, he added that he wanted to read the family's bloodline grimoire since he finally met the minimum requirements for it. So, it was time to challenge him, and Morden standing behind him exhaled heavily and said, "Bloodline grimoire." Looking at the master, he asked if the boy could definitely do it. And Leon turned to him and asked what was so special about it. Mikhail slightly lowered his head and replied that it was an ancient grimoire that contained the entire history of their family. Its true name was Lamageddon, and it was called a bloodline grimoire because it only responded to the blood of their family. Each page was handwritten and contained the history and power of the Walpurgis family. The grimoire was created by the first head of the Walpurgis family. Mikhail remembered that before his regression, the demon god army had already turned him into ashes. Leaving the memories, the boy raised his head and said that reading the grimoire meant challenging the history of the Walpurgis. Hearing this, Leon frowned and asked what if he failed. Mikhail thoughtfully looked down. Looking at the snake eating a mouse, he replied that he would become part of the grimoire. Without turning away, the boy said that if he failed, he would become the master of the Lem. Meeting Leon's gaze, Mikhail said that he needed to kill or be killed. Raising his hand to the sky, Mikhail thought that in fact he did not plan to become the master of the grimoire because his goal was only to study the origin of their bloodline. Looking up carefully, he wondered who the first Walpurgis was. Thinking, the boy wondered if he was a simple archmage of the 9th Circle or someone more. Lowering his head, Mikhail thought that there was another reason, and for it, he needed to obtain the knowledge of the Lemageddon. Suddenly, he turned to the boys. Smiling, Mikhail thought that his comrades would trust him and then told his human shields that it was time to go. The boys looked at him with disapproval, not moving. Set looked at him with confusion, saying that the tone had changed again. The Viscount looked ahead thoughtfully, thinking that sometimes days in which nothing happened were more upsetting than usual. He closed his eyes, wondering why he felt this way since nothing special had happened. Starting to swing his head in different directions, the man said that he was fine since the day he transferred. Lost in memories, he thought that having fallen straight to the 5th circle, his strength had weakened, but the circle had stabilized. The Viscount remembered that he did everything he could. Sitting with narrowed eyes, he thought that his strength had not strengthened too much. Smiling widely, showing fangs, the man thought that he liked it. Clenching his hands into fists, he raised his head to the magic seals, thinking that he had reached the 6th circle on the right path, and if his master had not helped. Looking ahead, he said in confusion that he was very grateful. Closing his eyes, the Viscount wondered in bewilderment why, instead of gratitude, he had goosebumps. Looking up at the birds on the branch, he said on an exhale that he liked the peace and quiet so much. Joining his poems, he asked not to return when suddenly Mikhail appeared behind him, who asked with a smile who the Viscount was talking about. The man slowly turned his head in bewilderment. Mikhail continued to smile broadly. Turning away, the magician lowered his head, saying that in addition to hearing voices, he now also catches hallucination. Walking forward, he said that he needed to go and drink the medicine. Finally, he asked the almighty Heko to protect him with her eternal light while MK continued to smile after him. Coming closer, the guy pushed the man with all his might. Rising, the system reported that Mikhail had acquired the 4th living shield. Folding his arms over his chest, the guy said that there were now 4 of them. When suddenly, the Viscount asked what he had in mind, to which he received a firm answer. Lemageddon. Closing his eyes, the man asked with a trembling voice if Mikhail had really said Lemageddon. Raising his hands, he asked with horror not to do this because his superiority would not allow it, and if the guy wanted the grimoire, he would still get it when it passed on by inheritance. Mikhail closed his eyes, answering that he did not have time to wait. The Viscount took a step forward, saying that the problem was not that, but that Mikhail did not have the authority to get it, and did he really want to break the protective barrier of the Lemageddon? Lowering his hands, he asked not to say it. Mikhail looked up at him, answering that he would get in there by force. Raising his hand up, the man asked in bewilderment who would guard the boy. Looking at the boys one by one, Mikhail counted to 4. Raising his index finger, he replied with a smile that he had 4 shields. Remembering his father, he said that the moment he got through the barrier and gained access to the Lemageddon, the Marquis would immediately understand it. Raising his hand up, he asked with a smile what job they would have done. Looking at the boys, he added that they would restrain his father. Smiling, Mikhail asked if they understood. Leon frowned with anger. Suddenly, he raised his hand up, showing his middle finger. Folding his arms across his chest, Mikhail nodded, thinking that this is what comrades are for. The Prophet's Archive. Mikhail stood in front of 2 guards. One of them raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked the boy what brought him to the archive. Mikhail looked at them coldly and asked in response, "Are there any options?" Adding that he needs to get inside because he is a direct descendant of Walpurgis, so he has the right to access the archive. Hearing this, the guards looked at each other weirdly. After a short pause, they crossed spears and asked if he could get permission from the Marquis, adding that even though he is his direct descendant, they cannot let him in. Then Set extended her hand and said that a couple of years ago he was just a disgrace to the family. Maybe that's why they do not trust him. Kyle raised his eyebrows and said to himself that after the regression, he did a lot. But as for the family's affairs, he has not proven anything to them yet. The guards looked at him with horror in their eyes. In their eyes, he looked like an insignificant idiot, and Mikhail said to himself that if he were in their place, then the disgrace of the family who was barely mentioned, for no reason, tries to get into the archive. But he showed his strong aura and said that he thought they were wrong. Smiling widely, he added that he came here as Walpurgis and as a hero. Then the guy took a step towards the guards and added that they were blocking his way. After which he asked if they could really handle this because he was just trying to get into his family's archive. Hearing this, the guards looked at each other again in fear. A few seconds later, they removed the barriers and apologized for their rude behavior. Yes, Mikhail asked with a slight smile. After that, he frowned menacingly and ordered them to open the doors faster. The doors to the archive creaked open. There was a pleasant green light inside the archive. Mikhail walked forward and Set, flying in front of him, suddenly said that she suddenly became interested in how long the history of the guy's family was. There were many books on the shelves with beautiful patterns, and Mikhail replied that he had no idea as long as the history of any great family. Looking forward, he suddenly added that the founder was different. Presenting the open book, he said that there was surprisingly little information about the founder, rumored to be a great 9th-Circle Mage. But before he revealed himself to the world who he was and what he did, almost nothing was known about it. On one of the pages, the founder of the Walpurgis family was drawn. After listening to her friend, Set put her fingers to her temple and said that he was simply Mr. Mystery. The guy suddenly stopped and firmly said that this was why he wanted to know more about him. In front of him was the dark room of the prophet, which was protected by a large number of magical seals. Set flew closer and asked why there were so many barriers, adding that he tried to break through them before his father came. Yes, Mikhail firmly answered, looking at the magical seals and adding that in addition to the fact that there were many barriers, they were also of a very high level. Without taking his eyes off them, he explained that it was usually impossible to remove them all in one fell swoop, but this only applied to non-relatives. Hearing this, the girl raised her eyebrows in surprise. The barriers glowed bright green, and Mikhail said that initially all of them. He took out a small dagger and finished speaking to react to the blood of the walls. Having said this, he cut his hand and said to himself that it was certainly difficult. But if the barriers had one thing in common, then it was still possible because he had encountered more hopeless situations. This situation was very similar to the one that had happened before Mikhail's regression. He often analyzed and deactivated magic. Each magic circle had different words written on it, such as defense, inversion, destruction, attack, and various types of barriers created by centuries. Kyle raised his cut hand, imagining his ancestors in front of him. He thought that it was similar to fighting them with barrier magic. The next second, he stretched out his wounded hand, splashing blood forward and saying to himself that his blood was soaked in real magic. Drops of blood fell on each barrier according to Mikhail's plan. The girl looked ahead with pity, asking if this was bloodline magic. Looking at the barriers, Mikhail said that he did not need to completely destroy them. Releasing mana, he added, "Just deactivate for a second." Set covered her body with her hands, trying to protect herself from the flow. Mikhail stood unwaveringly in place, looking ahead intently. His pupils suddenly dilated. A bright light covered the entire space around. In complete darkness, only the guy's closed eyes were visible. A few seconds later, he raised his eyelids. Looking around, Seth asked in bewilderment where they were. Turning to Mikhail, she asked if she had touched something wrong, to which the guy coldly answered, "No." Suddenly, he stopped abruptly. A huge silhouette appeared behind them. Seth turned back in horror. Mikhail turned his head, thinking that this was one of the family's unique spells, the Devourer of Walpurgis. Mikhail immediately took a step forward. Streams of magic quickly rushed around them. Looking down, the guy thought that this was another unique spell, after which he wondered if they had hidden magic in the shadows. Suddenly, something brightly lit up under his feet. Starting to stamp his feet, Mikhail raised one leg. Walking forward, he found himself in an illuminated space. Seth began to nervously comb through her hair, asking if the guy really calculated everything on the go and knew where the traps were, to which Mikhail, without turning around, replied that it was instinctive. Raising his head, he saw a barrier, asking if it was the final one. Taking a closer look, the guy saw a unique pattern. Imagining his father in front of him, Mikhail thought that a similar aura emanated from the barrier. Stretching his hand forward, Mikhail said that if the son was weaker than his own father, it would be a pitiful sight. Using force, Mikhail immediately broke the glass when suddenly a rough voice was heard that he did not think that the guy would come to visit after so much time. Mikhail looked down, The man leaned his head on his hand, asking if it was Aiden in front of him. The guy looked up at him, their gazes crossed, when suddenly the man answered. If what Mikhail thought about his essence was true, then yes. Looking at the table, he said that some would call it history. Turning to the side, the man added, and others magic. Stretching his hand, he said if he wanted to express it in the simplest way, he would say it like this. Smiling, he introduced himself, saying that he was Lemageddon. At the same time, there was silence near the castle. Suddenly, a loud explosion was heard, breaking the wall through and through. The knights began to run away in terror, shouting loudly that the Marquis was very angry. As they continued to run away, they asked what kind of man had angered the man while the dust rose up. The Marquis stretched out his hand, clinging to the wall with all his might. Throwing his club over his shoulder, he asked if Mikhail dared to touch Lemageddon. Raising his furious gaze forward, he added that he would break all the limbs of his dear son. The man known as the Holy Swordsman of the next generation of Leon quickly ran forward. He frowned angrily, but a couple of years ago, an opponent like him appeared when suddenly Mikhail's father appeared behind him, his eyes burning, ordering him to get out of the way. He attacked the boy with both magical and physical attacks, which only made him run away faster, shouting that he knew that he was strong, but tears flowed from his eyes, and he shouted that this was too much. Suddenly, a powerful lightning bolt struck his feet, causing the boy to fly. Leon fell face down on the floor. Morden tore his clothes and asked the Lord to calm down, but Idan sent Morden flying with one blow of the wooden bat, after which he screamed that they really thought they could fight him with their bare hands and win. The old man broke through the roof of the mansion with his body. The Viscount raised his magic wand with shaking hands. Without lowering it, he quietly asked the Lord to calm down and talk. Idan's eyes lit up even brighter, and he angrily said that he had not received anything from him yet. At the same second, he hit the magician with all his might with the bat, and exclaimed that he should have done it earlier. The Viscount, like Morden, broke through the roof of the mansion with his body. Island was shaking with fear at the sight of all this. She looked at the bat in the hands of Mikhail's father and asked herself in a nagging manner, what was it? Idan was emitting a terrifyingly powerful aura. Island's legs were shaking with fear, and in her head, she was saying that she couldn't move from the spot because of fear. She slowly raised her head to the man. She felt like a boy rabbit who froze in front of a huge predator. She felt like helpless prey. When suddenly, not far from her, Leon stood up. He raised his shaking sword with difficulty, and said that Idan cannot go further. Hearing this, the girl opened her mouth in shock. After a few seconds, she closed it. Mikhail's father looked at them with hatred in his eyes. Lean and Island stood in fighting stances. The guy frowned and asked why he did not trust his son. He had achieved so much. The Marquis silently lowered his head. After a short pause, he raised his leg and replied that he knew. Then he stepped. As soon as he did, his power fell on the guys. Resisting with all his might, Leon said that he had his reasons for going so far. Island frowned, trying to resist. That was the problem, Idan said menacingly, and Leon fell to one knee. His power was getting stronger with each passing second, and he continued to say that he was afraid of being absorbed by the Lemageddon, and then asked if they really thought that they were in such a hurry because of that, for no reason. Leon lowered his head more and more. Then, suddenly, he opened his mouth wide, resisting the Marquis's power. He slowly stood up. Leon suddenly saw a hand in front of his face. The Marquis covered their faces with his hands, then released magic, ordering them to sleep for a while. Removing his hands, they immediately fell to the ground. Without raising his head, the Marquis thought that his son had become a hero. He knew that a hero was someone who despised and destroyed demons, and if he found out about the Mage, the man clenched his teeth in anger at the thought. Mikhail suddenly saw the space begin to tighten. He watched it carefully. Looking down, Mikhail asked if the man was imitating the ancestor while Lemageddon poured tea. Answering that it was, and this was the original form of the boy's species and his creator. Moving the cup, he added that this was a man worthy of the title of great. Standing in front of the table, Mikhail heard Lemageddon asking him to sit down since the boy was having trouble breaking through the barrier. Mikhail closed his eyes, answering, "Okay," but first, spreading his arms, he raised a strong whirlwind. All the furniture immediately fell to the floor. Looking at it, the boy said that he got rid of the junk. Suddenly, Lemageddon narrowed his eyes, asking what he was doing. Starting to use mana, he said that tea and snacks created from the shadows would be great for poisoning someone. Mikhail frowned sternly, telling the man not to try to fool him with such cheap tricks. Editon's gaze was cold. Raising it to the boy, he asked how long Mikhail was going to talk to him informally, since he was the incarnation of the ancestor, the first Mikhail Valeries, and the boy, as a descendant, had to show him respect. Mikhail's fist trembled with anger, and he suddenly said that he felt his killing intent increasing. Standing menacingly before his opponent, he thought that he had fought the demon gods in Argo, and his feeling was familiar to him. Looking away, the boy thought that he had control over shadows, and therefore it was not difficult to guess what this meant. Looking at the man, he knew that he was a demon. Mikhail frowned, saying that he would not speak respectfully to the spawn of a demon. Migden folded his arms and chuckled. Lowering his gaze, he said that the idea that he was a demon just because he controlled shadows was too superficial. Mikhail looked at him menacingly and asked him to prove that he was not a demon. The space almost completely closed in when suddenly the demon laughed, saying that the guy had broken the barrier and burst in here, so he should not tell about his essence. They exchanged glances. Raising his heads up, Lemageddon said that the Marquis had arrived. Putting his hand to his chin, he asked what the guy would do, because at this rate he himself would have no choice but to get rid of him, an unwanted guest. Mikhail slightly tilted his head to the side. Grinning, he said that the demon should worry, not him, because if he disappeared, Lemageddon would be locked here forever again. The man's eyes immediately widened. His mouth was slightly open. Suddenly, he smiled slightly. Raising his hand up, he snapped his fingers. In front of them was a huge hourglass. The opponents stood opposite each other. Smiling widely, Lemageddon offered to talk. Lemageddon looked at the guest with a smile on his face. The boy looked at him, frowning with displeasure. Suddenly, he looked away and said to himself that his father had stopped. Looking at the huge hourglass, he wondered if it was under a spell that stopped time. Smiling widely, Lemageddon said that he agreed to talk. But suddenly, he extended his finger. Showing it to Mikhail, he said that that apostle should also join. Hearing this, Set was enveloped in powerful magical energy. Increasing herself in size, she said that no one except another apostle could read her presence. After which she asked how he knew. The man looked at her and said that she should have disappeared, adding that unlike the other apostles, she was left without protection. The girl looked away and Mikhail looked at her. After imagining how Mikhail saved Set, Lemageddon added that the younger Valpurgis had patched her up. He was able to do something very difficult even for an 9th-Circle Mage. Raising his eyebrows, he said that this was why he believed that he had surpassed even the 8th Circle. The wind was blowing their hair and Mikhail was asking, "So what?" To which he asked him to answer one question. There were glares from the sun on his hair. Looking at the guests, he suddenly asked if he could rescue him from here. Mikhail looked at the interlocutor with coldness in his eyes, after which he answered that he could not release him into freedom. Hearing this, Lemageddon wanted to snap his fingers, saying that he thought so. When suddenly, Mikhail said that he could release him to limited freedom. Hearing this, the man stopped. Lowering his hand, he asked what he was talking about, to which he replied that it was as he said. Raising his eyebrows, the boy finished by saying that he could allow him to leave the archive under certain conditions. Without taking his eyes off the other man, he said in his head that if necessary, he could free him completely, but he would not. He imagined a book that was entangled in chains and added that even if Lemageddon went outside the archive, he must be under complete control. The man continued to look at him, asking what he meant by unlimited freedom, to which Mikhail finished by saying that he would make a contract with him, and then asked if he agreed. The wind blew through Lemageddon's hair as he thought about his answer. He imagined a man sitting alone on the sand and said to himself that loneliness was indeed a terrible feeling. Imagining an hourglass, he added that no matter how powerful a Grimm he might be, he would still not be able to endure loneliness forever. Lemageddon silently looked at his guest. After a short pause, he answered with an indifferent expression that he accepted the conditions. Hearing this, Mikhail smiled and said to himself that he would never make a decision so quickly, after which he firmly said that the contract was concluded. A bow hung around Lemageddon's neck. Meeting their eyes, the guy added that all of the man's strength was now under his control, so he was allowed to use only a small part of his abilities. Lemageddon adjusted his collar, answering that it would not interfere. Lowering his hands, he said that his request was fulfilled, so they would move on to Mikhail, after which he asked what exactly he wanted to know. Raising his fingers up, he added that he could only grant 30% of the required information. Mikhail thought that 30% was not so little, and Lemageddon was rich in knowledge, after which he closed his eyes, answering that he thought so. Raising his gaze, the guy said that first he wanted to know about the founder. Lemageddon looked at him coldly, answering that he could not tell much about the creator. Lost in his memories, he replied that he, the grimoire, was created when the creator founded this family. Spreading his arms out to the sides, the man added that he did not know much about the previous creator, and of course, he knew little about his future actions either. Looking at him attentively, Mikhail asked him to tell him everything he knew. Lemageddon put his hand to his chin, thoughtfully answering that this could not be explained in a few words. Suddenly, he extended his hand forward, grinning. He asked to look at him. From a strong blow of the wind, Mikhail's hair began to flutter. His pupils suddenly became sharply wider. Grabbing his head, the guy leaned forward. Opening his fingers, Mikhail looked forward through them. Looking around, he asked if this was really his father's office. Lemageddon placed his hands on the table, thinking about the first Mikhail Valpurgis. Kneeling down, Mikhail began to sort through the papers. Looking at them, the guy saw many records of research. Throwing up his hands, he wondered what the founder was trying to do. Lemageddon turned to the book. Looking at it, he asked to remember the theories he had studied, for not a single symbol should be lost. Raising his head, Mikhail heard the man say that those who did not have the necessary qualifications did not have the right to read this, and a descendant with outstanding talents was no exception. Rounding his eyes, he added with a wild look that talent did not equal qualification. Looking down at the table again, Lemageddon said that only a person with the necessary qualifications could inherit it. Capillaries immediately appeared in the book's eye, after which he said that he would remember. Covering his ears with his hands, Mikhail began to shout loudly that there was interference. No longer hearing the dialogue, gritting his teeth, he thought that he should concentrate and hear at least one more word. Placing his hands on the table, the man said that this world was probably guarded. Lowering his head, he added that they were different. Mikhail's body was static. His eyes widened in surprise. His body was illuminated as he wondered who exactly it was from. The last words Mikhail heard before leaving the memory were, "We are different from them." Mikhail grabbed his head and Set took his hand and asked if he was okay. Opening his eyes, Mikhail said in his head that the progenitor was afraid of something. Remembering his ancestor, he added that he could not understand what exactly. Without raising his head, he asked Lemageddon if he knew, to which he firmly answered, yes, but he did not have the right to tell him about it at the moment. The boy lowered his hand and said in his head that during the time when the progenitor was still alive and when families called great houses arose in the empire, wars broke out across the continent, a time when they openly showed their hostility to each other. But it seemed that the progenitor was not afraid of this. Thinking about it, he remembered his ancestor at the table again. Looking away, the guy said that the answer was too vague while saying in his head, "No, it's okay. It's good that he managed to find out so much information and now all that's left is..." After thinking about it, he turned to Lemageddon, who folded his arms. As soon as the guy asked how much he could find out about the demon plague, the man smiled madly and answered as much as he needed. Sand slowly flowed down in the hourglass. White boots walked on the floor of the archive, and contact with Lemageddon was lost. Mikhail and Lemageddon walked through the archive. Mikhail looked at the guy next to him who was licking a lollipop and said to himself that in addition to the fact that he received information, he was also able to conclude a contract, which means he got a lot, but still. Suddenly, Legamaton turned to him and asked if he was ready yet. An hourglass appeared in his hand and he finished talking about an emotional reunion with his father who was waiting for him around the corner. Mikhail frowned with displeasure, saying to himself that it was time to face a real problem. Stopping, he replied that he came here ready to sacrifice a lot, but frowning even more, he added that he was actually nervous. After that, he closed his eyes and said that if punishment was waiting for more than just him, he would be happy, and Set flew up to him and told him to just accept it. Enough empty chatter. The green glow shimmered from the hourglass. The sand and it continued to slowly flow. The boy looked ahead in confusion, and there was a smile on Legajetan's face. Not far in front of them were the massive doors to the archive, when suddenly they shuddered. Suddenly Idan, with his enormous strength, knocked them off their hinges. Throwing the bat over his shoulder, he furiously screamed that his son was a bastard. Mikhail immediately extended his hand and asked his father to stop because violence only breeds tragedy. Looking at his father walking towards him, he added that he should be stronger than his anger, to which his father shouted in displeasure, ordering him to shut up. But suddenly, he stopped seeing something. Behind his son, he saw Lemageddon imprisoned in chains and wondered if he was still locked up. After that, his displeased expression disappeared. Smiling widely, he said that he didn't even have time to access Lemageddon, adding that breaking the barrier was a good trick. But Mikhail looked at his father, not lowering his hands. When suddenly he said that, of course, he had gained access to him, which made Idan raise an eyebrow in surprise, and asked if he really had gained access. Legijetit stood to the side and with a smirk on his face said that he wanted to say that he had already cancelled the contract. Looking intently at Idan, he suddenly asked if it was true that about 20 years had passed, to which Idan asked in response if it was true that he had made a contract with his son. The guy looked at Mikhail and replied that he was different from him and his ancestors who saw him only as a threat and locked him up. Hearing this, the Marquis put his hand to his face and turned to his son. Lowering his hand, he quietly asked if he had seen what exactly Lemageddon was. Presenting the book, he added that it was the origin of the grimoire, after which he asked why at all. Mikhail looked intently at his father and interrupted him and replied that he knew all the details. He smiled broadly and added that whatever his origin was, it did not matter to him, while also saying that he had some guesses, but he could not call them true. Hearing this, Idan raised his eyebrows in surprise and asked if even though he was a hero. The boy extended his hand, asking if he had an existence without approval, the gods would have chosen him. He added that he did not resent such things and did not despair because of them, after which his father closed his eyes, answering that he was right. Looking around, Mikhail said that the success in concluding the contract meant that the book could now leave the archive and for now its area of staying was limited to the mansion. Looking out into the corridor, he added that the mansion was still spacious enough, and for Lemageddon this deal was also not bad. Putting his hands behind his head, the progenitor smiled, saying that he would behave diligently, so there was no need to worry. Closing his eyes, the Marquis thought. Putting the club down, he replied, "Okay," since as the head of the family, he understood his reasoning. The boy's eyes widened in surprise, wondering if he would really get away with it. Bowing, he thanked his father, then apologized for barging in. Smiling, Mikhail said that it would be great to spend time together. But even now, there were those who needed help, and he had to do his duty as a hero, so he thought his father understood. Turning around, he said that it was time for him to run. Suddenly, he stopped abruptly, hearing his father call out to him. Mikhail's eyes widened, and he slowly turned his head. The Marquis smiled widely, pointing to his shoes. He asked him to leave them there. The man asked if his son was familiar with the concept of equivalent exchange, since if he wanted to get something, he had to pay a decent price for it. Mikhail smiled in confusion, answering that this law did not exactly apply to their situation. The Marquis extended his hand forward, saying that his heart was telling him to forgive his son. Suddenly, he threw the baton onto his palm. With a sly grin, he said that this thing in his hands was telling him the opposite. They looked at each other wordlessly. Without thinking, Mikhail suddenly activated teleportation, after which he disappeared. A few seconds later, the guy was in the sky, dangling her legs from his shoulder. Seth said that Mikhail really doesn't think twice before running away. Lowering the corners of his lips, Mikhail replied that she simply doesn't know his father. His face changed. He menacingly shouted that he wasn't born with his character, so he was quite gentle, but his father was completely different. The girl narrowed her eyes in bewilderment. Turning away, the guy said that he just needed to lie low for a while and wait until his father calmed down. Wiping the sweat from his face, Mikhail smiled broadly. Spreading his arms out to the sides, he thought about how he had finally managed to make a contract with Lemageddon. Suddenly, he sensed something was wrong. Gritting his teeth in anger, Mikhail asked why he couldn't move. The Marquis appeared behind him, menacingly, answering that he had stopped his son, after which he asked if he liked being caught surreptitiously without the ability to move. Raising his hand with the baton up, the man said that it was time to teach the boy a lesson. Grabbing the handle with both hands, he shouted that he would do it quickly. Turning around, Mikhail loudly called out to his father. His eyes widened. He asked them to wait, while the blow was getting closer and closer. The boys sat opposite each other. Lowering her head, Aileen asked upsetly if Mikhail had succeeded. Rewinding his hand, Leon replied that he thought so, because that's the kind of person he is. Raising his finger up, Morden pointed to the window. Everyone turned around to see a falling star. Aileen frowned, asking why it was red. Did meteors like that even exist? While Leon smiled, asking for a wish. They all folded their hands together. Closing his eyes, Leon mentally wished for Mikhail to become a rational person. Lowering his head, Aileen asked for this journey to be normal for the first time. Closing his eyes, Morden wished with a smile for physical magic to reach even greater heights this year. The Viscount raised his hands up, sincerely wishing for the master not to return for at least another 10 years. Opening his eyes, the guys began to watch the star. This happened before Mikhail's regression, or to be more precise, right now. He and his team were standing in a burning city. Madness began to spread across the world. People lost their minds and began to kill each other. Mikhail looked at this with horror in his eyes. Cannibalism began to flourish in the raging flames. The maddened inhabitants fought with each other. Madness covered all inhuman acts. Mikhail hit the wall with all his might, with his fist. Gritting his teeth, he asked where to even start. He saw people die. He realized too late that this damned catastrophe was the cause. Blood splashed into the air. It slowly dripped onto the ground. It poured from the hand of Mikhail, who said in his head, "There was that place." Currently, he was lying in bed and saying that his bones were healing faster than he thought. Looking at the ceiling, he added that he thought he would return to normal in about a week, remembering how his father beat him. The guy said in his head that he had received so many times from the past, and it still did not teach him anything. He was just surprised when suddenly he sat up on the bed, and Set flew up to him, and asked why he was smiling like that, as if there was something to be proud of. A few minutes later, she raised her eyebrows and asked if that really meant the plague. Mikhail silently lowered his gaze. The two of them discussed what awaited them in the future, imagining terrifyingly strong demons. Mikhail said to himself that 2 archdemons had already disappeared, and the archdemons who could not allow the loss of another monarch would definitely begin to act. The torches burned with a bright purple flame. Raising his head, the guy said that before his regression, this action meant a plague. Imagining people who had lost their minds, he said to himself that the real face of the plague was the spread of madness. Remembering how he looked at the city engulfed in flames, he added that it drove people crazy, dividing them into groups. Now he was sitting on the bed and saying in his head that the plague could not be stopped once it had already begun. There was a bright moon in the sky, and before Mikhail's regression the first recorded outbreak of madness was, but before he finished speaking he imagined the dark forest, and said that they needed to go there. Suddenly a guy came out to him, and asked if he was ready to rush there. It was Lemageddon with a sly smile on his face. He took Mikhail's hand. Powerful magical energy flowed through Mikhail's body, and the guy explained that this was his right to access Lemageddon. Letting go of his hand, he added that he could not take him outside the mansion, so he needed to somehow gain access to his knowledge. Mikhail focused his attention on the guy's red aura and said to himself that it was very similar to demonic. Lowering his eyes, he added that it was something between human and demonic. In his hand, he saw a small book, and Lemageddon explained that this was a summary of Lemageddon, which contained all the most important things. Hearing this, Mikhail raised his eyebrows in surprise. The guy added that if he needed anything, the knowledge would appear in his mind, to which he closed his eyes and said to himself that the most important thing now was the knowledge of the dark forest. As soon as he thought about this, the book began to quickly flip through the pages. When the book opened the right page, the warrior said to himself in surprise, "So that's how it works," adding that before that he did not have a detailed understanding of the dark forest. Taking the book in his hands, the guy thought that this was just wonderful. Smiling, Lemageddon said that if Mikhail was a hero, then his duty was to correct the outcasts of the dark forest. The outcasts were in the forest. Initially, they were innocent creatures blessed by Yggdrasil, but they escaped from there. Frowning, Mikhail thought that it was the dark elves he would have to deal with. Entering the office, the Marquis happily greeted his son. Smiling widely, he asked Mikhail how his father's warm welcome was after so much time apart. Taking a step forward, Mikhail said that his father was apparently in a good mood, after which he suggested lowering his weapon and talking calmly. The man lowered his baton, saying that since his son had come here, it meant he was already planning to leave. The guy smiled, answering that he had little time, so he would grab a couple of people from Tia. The Marquis raised his eyebrows in surprise. Putting his hands on the table, he asked if his son had a reason for this because he was not exactly against it. After which Mikhail clenched his hands into fists, answering that he was thinking about going to the dark forest. Leaning his head on his hand, the father replied that it sounded interesting. Then he began to remember those two when suddenly the guy interrupted him, confidently answering that most likely they were from that forest. The head of the Tia guild was Hido's, and with him was his adopted daughter, the dark elf Mia. Looking at his thoughtful father, Mikhail was sure that the man had heard about this. Not all dark elves live in that forest, but the noble dark elves all came from there. Hido's was writing something on a piece of paper. Looking at the notes, he exhaled heavily, scratching the back of his head. The elf said that the information guild was overloaded with work. The door to his office suddenly swung open. Mia quickly ran inside with loud screams. Without turning around, Hido's asked what happened. With her eyebrows knitted, the elf screamed in fear that he really had come. Closing her eyes, the man asked who. After a few seconds, he raised his eyelids. Suddenly, footsteps were heard. Mikhail waved with a smile on his face, greeting the elf. Mia jumped away from him in fear. Looking at Hido's, Mikhail asked what was wrong with him because they had not seen each other for so long. Turning to the shocked Mia, he asked why they were so downcast. The elf bowed, saying that Mikhail had arrived. Mikhail nodded with his arms outstretched, saying that he had a task for the two of them. He grinned and asked if they had thought about returning to their homeland. Hido's opened his eyes in shock. He dropped his arms and suddenly added that he couldn't hide it for the rest of his days. He turned around and asked with a smile if he was right. Mia frowned while fear was visible in her eyes. The dark elf held his hands in front of the elf and said that he could only trust him. Tears began to flow from the elf's eyes, and the dark elf asked her to take care of Mia. Hido's recalled this with his eyes closed, and Mikhail said that he couldn't hide her forever, and then asked if that was true, calling the girl the priestess's apprentice. Hearing this, the elf opened his eyes. Mikhail put his hand on his hip, and Hido suddenly asked him how much he knew about the priestess of the dark forest. The boy bowed his head and said that he knew that she was the central figure that united the dark forest. He looked at her intently and asked if she was perhaps an honorable sacrifice. Mia silently crossed his arms. Hido's put his hand to his chest and said, "A sacrifice for sure." Introducing the priestess, he said that the clan praised her, but in reality she was still a simple sacrifice. A huge woman loomed over the girl. Mia lowered her gaze and said that in the dark forest, the corpse of an ancient ancestor of the elf was buried. Imagining how one elf killed another, she said that to be more precise, the corpse of the ancestors who was betrayed by her own sister dying, she cursed her sister until her last breath. The elf extended her hand. As a result, her curse darkened the forest. A flame arose. As hundreds, and then thousands of years passed, the forest became even more frightening and creepy. But there were always fugitives coming there because there was no better place for them because they had all gotten used to the darkness. A small book appeared in Mikhail's hand, and he said to himself that it contained some of this information, after which he said that she was probably an elf of noble and royal blood. Mia looked at the guy in surprise and asked how he knew. Closing the book, Mikhail replied that if her anger alone was enough to destroy an entire forest, she could not be an ordinary elf. Mia pitifully frowned and said that the vengeful spirit of the ancestor would never be able to forgive her sister who betrayed her. But she soon went to eternal peace, leaving no opportunity to apologize. After listening to the dark elf, Mikhail said that because of this, the priestess was used, to which she silently nodded. After a few seconds, she said that they had chosen those who resembled the ancestor's sister in character or appearance, and forced them to bear the wrath of the vengeful spirit. Neil looked ahead and added, "Not killing them." Raising her head, she finished but slowly drove them crazy. Having said this, she closed her mouth. Kyle looked at the girl and said to himself that this forest was necessary for the dark elves, and he needed someone to vent his anger on. A bright moon floated across the sky. The fuse burned slowly. Instead of letting go of the grudge, everything came to an endless cycle of suffering. It was like a huge powder keg waiting to explode. Turning to the elf, Mikhail said that if Mia was the priestess's apprentice, then Hidos must be her guardian. To which the man nodded, agreeing with this. Closing his eyes, he said that he was Set, the current priestess of the Dark Forest. Recalling the past, Hidos said that at her request, he took Mia from there. The tip of his ear was black. Noticing this, Mikhail realized that in the process, his curse had awakened, approaching the end. Looking at each other, the boy asked if there was anyone to replace Mia, to which Hidos shook his head, answering that at least this process would take 100 years. Clenching his hand into a fist, the elf angrily added that the current priestess would never live that long. Putting his hand on his heart, Hidos said that even Mikhail was powerless here because the dark forest was huge and the resentment of the clan was very deep. Mikhail pursed his lips, looking at him. Nodding, he replied, "Nothing." Mikhail threw his staff over his shoulder. Putting his hand on his hip, the boy said that he just had to teach everyone a lesson. Without looking up, the elf was shocked, asking what. The knights walked along the corridor, guarding the entrance. There was movement in the shadows behind them. It was pitch black inside. The elf turned his gaze to the side, telling his partner that the Walpurgis barrier had weakened. Pabellin frowned confidently, saying that this was their chance. Looking out into the corridor, they said that they had finally found Mia, but she had escaped to the Walpurgis. The boy moved forward, saying that they should be grateful that they had found her at all. Sneaking closer and closer, the elf thought that if they did not return the priestess's apprentice, then the forest clan had no future. There was no guard near the doors. Carefully opening the doors, the elves noticed the apprentice standing with her back to them. Looking back, the boy said that her guard was not nearby. Mia continued to do her own thing. The elf frowned, ordering his partner to concentrate. Pabellin confidently looked forward, answering that he knew. Holding the syringe in his hand, he thought that the priestess was not their relative. Coming closer, he continued that she was a simple victim. Mia still did not turn back. Pabellin grabbed the syringe more tightly. Suddenly, he raised his hand up. Intending to lower it, he gathered courage. Suddenly, a shiny knife stopped his hand. With a mad smile, Mikhail held the knife to his throat and then asked if they had fallen into a trap so easily. Pabellin carefully looked away, wondering when Mikhail had managed to get closer. His hand began to shake when suddenly he thought that there was Keel. Frowning, he looked forward, thinking that the elf was hiding much better than him. Mikhail pointed to the floor with a smile, asking if Pabellin was looking for this guy. The elf suddenly lowered his head down. At his feet, he noticed Keel, who was lying motionless with foam at the mouth. Pabellin slowly turned his head to the opponent, asking in fear who he was. The guy smiled briefly, answering, "Hero." Turning his mad gaze to his opponent, he added, "A hero who defeats bastards like them." A few minutes later, Pabellin fell on his comrade. Mikhail, covered in blood, exhaled heavily, and he was asked if he was finished already. When Hidos approached the attackers, Mikhail asked him if he recognized their faces, to which he replied that they were the elite warriors of the forest. Closing his eyes, he quietly said that when they still lived there, they were among those who advocated for the preservation of the priestess system. No, they were even worse. Hearing this, the guy raised his eyebrows and asked, "In what way worse?" Then Hidos remembered the elves who raised their hands to the sky and said that they worshipped the vengeful spirit of the dark forest. Their hands rose higher and higher, and they called themselves Sharans. Without opening his eyes, Hidos continued to say that. In addition, these people instructed that the vengeful spirit of the forest not remain only within its borders. Hearing this, Mikhail shuddered. Shock and horror appeared in his eyes and he asked himself, "What?" A few seconds later, he raised his hand to his face and said, "So that's how it is." Remembering the mad people, he thought about how before his regression, the reason for the madness spreading, turning the world into chaos. Now he understood everything. Because unlike the times before his regression, he remembered Mia and finished speaking. She was still alive. Imagining a cloud of flame, the guy said in his head that he cannot leave a single coal behind. He needs to destroy them before he burns everything to the ground. Huge piles were burning with a bright flame. Leaving his thoughts, the guy turned around and said that he wanted to ask me something. The girl abruptly turned away from him, which made him ask in surprise, "Is something wrong?" With a trembling hand, she pointed forward and said, "A staff?" In Mikhail's hand was a bloody staff. Hearing this, the guy looked down at his weapon. After a short pause, he raised his head and asked what was wrong. He was fine, which made Set slap her face and say that he seemed to lack the voice of reason. Then Mikhail asked if everyone in the Dark LSU was going crazy over the idea of sacrificing the priestess, to which Mia shook her head and answered no. The elves argued among themselves. There were those who wanted to leave the forest or fight the vengeful spirit. The elf extended his hand, but many simply wanted to maintain the status quo. She looked at Mikhail, who spoke for her that people with such ideas were shut up. Closing his eyes, he firmly said that he understood everything when he suddenly added that in that case there was no need to destroy them all. As soon as Mia heard this, horror appeared in her eyes, and Hido's, when he heard this, frowned in excitement. Seeing such a reaction, the guy asked in surprise why they twitched so. Mia waved her hand and replied nothing. After which she added that for a second she thought he was really ready to raise their entire clan to the ground. Hearing this, Mikhail raised his eyebrows in surprise. He raised his hand. Bringing it to his head, he said to himself that this was a nightmare because even his innocent words were perceived incorrect. Lowering his head, he turned to Set, saying that she had been with him for quite some time, so she knew how absurd such a misconception was. Then the girl looked at him in surprise and asked if he really wasn't seriously going to destroy them all. Receiving such an answer, Mikhail raised his head with tears in his eyes, saying to himself, "What a terrible misunderstanding." The stranger looked at his feet. Hablan slowly opened his eyes. His hands were chained. Looking around, the elf asked in bewilderment where he was. Raising his head, he saw a silhouette in front of him. Coming closer, Mikhail waved to him with a smile on his face. He grinned and said he would be brief. The guy extended his index finger forward. A strong blow of mana suddenly flew into Pablin's body. His gaze immediately changed and his pupil greatly decreased in size. Baring his teeth, he screamed loudly in pain. Lowering his menacing gaze, Mikhail ordered him to tell everything he knew about the dark forest. Without raising his head, Pablin replied that it was useless because no matter how much they tortured him, it was impossible to beat even a grain of information out of him. Sticking out his tongue, the elf with a crazy look screamed that their ancestors needed freedom. A small tattoo was visible on his tongue. Mikhail immediately noticed it, trying to take a closer look. Meeting their eyes, Mikhail apologized for ruining this dramatic moment, but he had already cancelled his self-destruction spell, causing beads of sweat to appear on the elf's face. Rolling his eyes, Pavlin wondered if the dark essence that permeated their clan's history had been undone by him. Mikhail lowered his index finger down. The burning arrows pierced his opponent's arms again. Taking a step forward, Mikhail said that they would cause a disaster in the future that would be beyond their control. Coming closer, the boy added that countless people would die because of it, causing the elf to narrow his eyes, asking what he was even talking about. Mikhail put his hand to his chest, answering that at first he thought that the archdemon was responsible for resolving the forest. Suddenly, he straightened his hand, piercing Pavlin's arms with arrows. Mikhail added that he was wrong. Watching the elf suffer, he said that from the very beginning, it was the man who mistook their twisted beliefs for true faith who tore the world apart. His eyes widened, he straightened his fingers, saying that this simply pissed him off. Putting his hand on the elf's forehead, Mikhail said that he would ask a question. Closing Pablin's eyes, he asked him why he thought he was telling him this secret. The elf bared his teeth in fear. Kyle smiled, answering, "Exactly." Holding the elves by the heads, the guy said that they were in a dream. Closing his eyes, he said that here the elf would experience the full range of pain, but would not be able to die even if he wanted to. Opening his eyes, he greeted him with a smile in the abyss of consciousness. Starting to shake his head in different directions, Kill screamed in horror that he would tell everything. Raising his index finger up, Mikhail answered no. Releasing arrows in different directions, he added that he would never trust the words of a reasonable person. Putting his finger to his chin, Mikhail firmly said that he would not believe a single word. After some time, Mikhail let go of his hand from their faces. Standing in front of the bodies, he said that they had finally told all the information. Without turning around, Mikhail explained that a stranger had recently entered the dark forest, and thanks to the stranger's intervention, Sharon's faction had gained influence. After which Mia fearfully raised her hands to her chest, asking in confusion, "A stranger?" Turning his head, Mikhail said that he was quite special. He said that the one whom the dark elves called sacred was their ancient ancestor. The sound of heels was heard along the corridor. The girl stopped, crossing her arms. She confidently looked forward while Mikhail said that her name was ID. A huge palace rose into the sky. In it, a girl entered through the open doors. She was met by a man in the shadows and asked how she liked his plan. I looked away. Without turning around, she firmly answered, "Not bad." To which he replied, looking at her back, that today was a grand day. The Dark King, Bron, smiled and added that Sharon had secured the majority of the votes, so she would not be disappointed. Ida turned slightly and said, That makes sense. That means the sages who understand the contradictions of the forest are beginning to speak out." A staff appeared in her hand and she added that the king should remember this. Putting the staff down, she firmly said that she did not want her anger to be locked inside the forest. Powerful magical energy was moving through the forest, and the girl was asking what had trapped her in this forest and made her endure hatred and resentment. None other than the current humanity. The elf raised her head and added that it was very funny that only she and her children were forced to endure such things. So the hatred should go beyond the forest. A bright moon floated across the light sky. The king silently looked at Ida, who continued to say that humanity was not like them, who were able to adapt. They will kill and doubt each other, and then they will emerge victorious. Hearing this, Bactrian smiled madly and said to himself, "Finally, such a chance has come." Imagining the elf among the trees, he said in his head that for years of humiliation, they were locked in this forest. Then he imagined the elf in a large cage and added that as a king, he could only mourn those years. After these thoughts, he knelt before Eater and said that they were waiting for the Great Mother to return to them, and then asked what she wanted from him. The elf looked at him with her brows drawn together. After a short pause, she turned away and replied that she wanted to see how much her hatred had grown because today was the day of the meeting with the priestess. At this time, Mikhail and his people were riding horses into the dark forest. While everyone was on horseback, Morden carried his steed on his back. Leon looked at the sky and said that the stars were so bright today, maybe because they were on the way to the forest. Hearing this, Mikhail raised his head. Seeing the brightly shining stars, he quietly said, "The night sky." Then he closed his eyes and said in his head that it was very funny how old memories began to emerge in memory. That day, he and his crew looked up at the sky and saw that it had changed. And the Beast King said with displeasure that everyone thought they were prospering and living in peace. An elf came up to him and said that she hoped that he would find peace of mind, to which he chuckled and said that it was very funny because peace would not heal this world. Ariel closed her eyes and said that she agreed with this, adding that the world would turn into a nightmare. While they were talking, Mikhail looked at them from the side. He raised his eyebrows and did not take his eyes off them. Then suddenly he smiled warmly. A few minutes later, the Beast King sat down on the ground. He put his hands under his head and looked at the sky with a sarcastic expression on his face. Ariel now lay down next to them and cursed so much that the people begged her to at least repeat herself to be polite. Helen lay down not far from them and smiled bitterly. Sigurd was with them, looking at the sky with his arm outstretched. Mikhail lay with them, closing the circle and saying in his head that almost all the memories of that time were bad. But he was surprisingly pleased with that moment of watching the night sky before going to sleep. Mikhail, putting his hands under his head, looked at the starry sky. A few minutes later, he closed his eyes. It was the same now. After a short pause, he lowered his head and said that it was just funny, suddenly thinking about the past, but there was still the same warm smile on his face, after which he suggested that they take a rest here because it was already a deep night. They made a fire. Everyone was doing their own thing around it. Suddenly, Mikhail was called out, which made him flinch. Mia sat down not far from him, and the guy asked what was going on. Was she really talking to him? Looking at her, he reminded her how she always screamed when she saw him, and then ran away. Hearing this, the girl threw a displeased look at him and asked if she really couldn't approach him now. She put her hands on her legs and said that she just wanted to tell him something. Looking down, she added about the priestess because everything is much more complicated than he thinks. Mikhail turned with interest, asking how much more complicated it was. Without raising her head, Mia said that she did not know if it was always like this, but she and her sister were very different. Looking to the side, she said that it would probably be easier for her to put everything on her shoulders. Looking at Hyasang, the elf said that if her sister did this, she would be able to stay with their father. Without taking his eyes off her, Mikhail asked if it was easy to pass on the role of the priestess to another. Frowning, Mia replied that she did not know, but giving up everything for her would hardly suit her sister. Closing her eyes, she did not let the guy say, adding that this was all she wanted to say. The girl wrapped her legs with her hands, saying that Mikhail does this because he has to. Smiling, she suddenly thanked him for going with her. Mikhail was shocked by what he heard. Turning away, the guy said in surprise that the elf thanked him. Looking at Mia, Mikhail thought that initially she was a girl who was destined to go through the thorny path of a priestess apprentice. The girl's feet were covered in blood. Walking away, Mikhail thought that now she seemed to have decided to walk this thorny path alone. Watching the embarrassed girl, the guy thought that even so she decided to accompany him. And since she decided to thank him, it means she wanted to sort everything out from the very beginning. Hanging his hands, the young man said that he was interested in something. Without turning around, he asked how she felt about those dark elves she saw, from which Mia's gaze immediately changed. She suddenly turned away, raising her gaze to the sky. After a short pause, the elf turned around, answering that they needed to change to free themselves from hatred, and she thought that they needed to get rid of ID's curse. Looking up at the sky, Mikhail answered, "I see." After thinking, he finally understood what her answer was. A large number of candles brightly illuminated the room. While Mikhail thought that the priestess was taking on all the anger and madness that accumulated in the dark forest. Kneeling down, the elf sat on the magic seal. Her ankles were chained. With a mad, empty look, she looked down, and to put it more clearly, she was playing her role. The girl's pupil greatly decreased in size, peering into the darkness. After a few seconds, her pupil became much larger. Looking up, the girl's body began to tremble with fear because she was playing the role of Himura, Ida's sister. A formidable girl stood in front of her. The priestess raised her index finger up. With a slight movement of her hand, she immediately broke all of her sister's fingers. A few seconds later, Hammer felt a lot of pain, screaming loudly. Ida quickly covered her mouth with her hand, knocking her down. The elf asked if it hurt, and when the girl betrayed her, it hurt her too. Her eyeballs turned black as she menacingly asked if her younger sister ever tried to understand her. Squeezing her sister's mouth, she said that it hurt her terribly because the girl said that they would go through everything together. Tears flowed from Hemera's eyes as her older sister continued to apply great force, saying that she trusted her. Lowering her hand, Ida began to insert it into her sister's body, adding that she believed that her sister would help her. Tears flowed from Hemera's eyes as she thought in her mind that she did nothing. Continuing to cause pain, Ida thought that she just wanted to protect her younger sister. Suddenly, she pressed on her stomach, causing blood to spurt out. Hemera's eyes quickly widened in pain. She screamed loudly. A dark continued to hang over her body. The girl came to trying to catch her breath in horror. Putting her hands on the floor, the elf looked down. The man came closer, blowing out the candle. He looked at Runia, saying that she had done an excellent job of her role, so he praised her efforts. The elf suddenly came to her senses, calmly looking down. Raising her head, King Iser stood in front of her. A female voice was heard behind him. Runi's eyes widened in fear. Ida slowly emerged from the shadows. Rushing back, Runi screamed loudly. She began to scratch the wall, asking for it to stop. Fear was visible in her eyes. Idar smiled, saying that her expression was very cute. Licking her lips, she added that it was excellent food for her. A weak magical energy emanated from the trees. It enveloped everything around in the forest. Leon looked at it and said in surprise, "So this is what the dark forest looks like. Incredible." Suddenly, he abruptly turned his gaze, saying that he felt uneasy. To which Hitos replied that everything was fine because with each generation this gloomy feeling only intensified. That's how it should be. Nia, crossing her arms, walked behind when suddenly a brightly glowing fairy appeared in front of them who began waving her arms and shouting attention. She flew in front of Mikhail's face, shouting that this was enemy territory. Everyone needed to be on guard, to which he asked in surprise when she managed to dress up like that. Set on his shoulder raised her hand and said that from the fair's point of view, they would always be wary of the dark forest, adding that she involuntarily began to feel hostility towards fairies who were distorted by malice. Hearing this, Mikhail looked at his friend. Imagining a small fairy with red eyes, he grinned. They watched from all sides while he added that this was definitely not a good sign. Suddenly, an arrow appeared out of nowhere. It flew past the boy. Morden looked at the arrow stuck in the ground and laughing said, "What a warm welcome." At the same second, another arrow flew out of a nearby tree and another one from the next. Another arrow appeared from a third. Cutting through the air, it flew towards Mikhail. Several arrows were approaching the boy and his comrades. Mikhail lowered his head and turned to Set. The next second, a powerful tornado arose. Leon and Island had to raise their hands to resist the wind. Hidos, frowning, did not move. Suddenly, he looked in one direction. The next second, he looked in another direction. In a few seconds, the dark elf counted as many as 6 opponents. Then he took out a dagger. Then he tensed his leg. Without thinking twice, he destroyed all his opponents with one attack. The attackers fell to the ground. One of them, standing on his feet, shouted that Hetz was a traitor, adding that the great elders had raised him and made him a skilled killer, but he had betrayed not only their kindness, but also the apprentice priestess herself. The man listened to him with his back to him. Turning around, Mikhail asked if Hades knew them. Looking at the elves, Hades replied that they were his relatives, candidates for the role of the priestess's guard. Taking up his staff, Mikhail said that they were losers. The elf frowned, shouting loudly for the guy to shut up and not to dare put them in the same row with the one who betrayed their clan and the priestess. Swinging his staff, the guy ordered him to shut up. He threw his weapon over his shoulder and said that they stole an ordinary human child and raised him to be a murderer, so there was nothing to be proud of. Removing the curse from him, Mikhail saw the human form hidden in him. Looking into the distance, the boy thought that maybe Hito sensed it because he told him how he became a guardian. Raising his head, Mikhail thought that it was not difficult. He knew that these immortal creatures secretly chose human children with outstanding abilities and then kidnapped them, leaving their parents to grief. The monsters raised the children in their clan. Opening their mouths, they fed them an unknown liquid. In other words, Hitos never wanted to receive the title of guardian. Turning away, Mikhail said that he did not care about their inferiority complex. Looking at the elves, he asked if they were really ordered to guard this place and take them outsiders prisoner, which made them frown. Looking at Mikhail's back, they asked in bewilderment, "So what?" Turning around, the guy with a burning gaze replied that he was hinting that they should take them to their leadership right away. Pointing to the path, the elf said that it would lead to them. With a trembling hand, he said in fear that there were no tricks here. Suddenly, the elf put his hands on the ground, tying ropes around their necks. Mikhail ordered them to lead them, sparing no effort, and then began to keep count. Sweating, the elves tried their best to move forward. The guys behind Mikhail's back watched what was happening in surprise. Hearing loud cries that a traitor was coming, Mikhail turned around abruptly. The elves were waving their weapons furiously, throwing stones at the elf. They wished him death. Leon looked closely, asking if it was Karen. Watching the fight, Mikhail thought, "This is what happens when power falls into the hands of extremists who are not worthy of such power." The elf smirked, saying that everything had to turn out this way, because this is what their awakened ancestors were waiting for. Browsing, he added that they were traitors who denied the mother, whom even the king himself recognized, so traitors do not deserve a drop of sympathy. Looking at him, Mikhail ordered him to shut his mouth. Having made a fire, the elves praised Ida. Burning the traitor, they wished for their rebellious ancestors to have power. With a malicious grin, they shouted that this was righteous revenge on the entire outside world. Grabbing his staff, Mikhail wondered if the dark elves behaved like this even before the regression. Lowering his head, only one thought came to him at that moment. Seth looked at the guy excitedly. Mikhail stared ahead with a wild look, wondering if he should just kill them all right there. Mikhail watched as the elves praised ID by the fire, adding that now their risen ancestors would regain their strength. This made the veins on the guy's face stand out in rage. Set looked at her friend worriedly and after a short pause asked if he was okay. Hearing the girl's call, he came to his senses. He saw Set's pitiful and worried look. But in his eyes there was only hatred and contempt. Putting his hand to his face, he answered, "Not quite." After a few seconds, he looked at his palm and said in his head that he needed to calm down. He couldn't let his emotions get the better of him. Returning to his comrades, the guy said that everything was worse than he thought. A meeting with higher-ups would hardly change anything. To which Hitos asked what they should do then. Mikhail looked at the elf and asked if he didn't have someone to save, which was why he had followed him here. Hitos closed his eyes and asked if he was talking about Rinia. The guy extended his hand and said yes, adding that he should do what he had to do because he wouldn't sit idly by either. He placed the medal in the dark elf's hands and explained that it should help with the barrier that was holding the priestess. But he shouldn't try to free her right away. He just needed to come closer and wait. Hitos bowed and thanked the Lord, then asked, "What about him?" Mikhail looked up and said that talking wouldn't help, so he would have to change their plans. Hitos listened to the guy with his eyes closed. Wishing him luck, he disappeared. Mikhail smiled happily and said that they needed someone who knew their way around well. The dark elves he had captured looked at him excitedly. After a few seconds, they looked at each other, and the boy asked if no one volunteered. He put up his index finger and said that they would do this then. With his eyes closed and a wide smile on his face, he explained that out of the 6 of them, he would only take one with him. Hearing this, the elf raised his eyebrows in fear and asked what would happen to the rest, to which the boy replied that they would be able to leave. When the elves heard this, they shuddered in surprise, and MK ordered them to close their eyes, after which he would choose the one for whom the majority voted. The dark elves obediently closed their eyes. The warrior took a step forward, passing behind the prisoners. He said that the night had fallen, which meant it was time to point out the victim. All 6 frowned tensely. Less than a minute later, Mikhail stopped, standing next to the second elf from the left. He turned to him and asked his name. The guy opened his eyes and said his name. When Mikhail said that he would go with them and the rest could go free, Gibro threw his arms out and screamed, asking why him, adding that he should not have been chosen. A minute ago, he pointed his hand to the side and Mikhail said that then it was he who pointed at someone with closed eyes. Mikhail added, "Pointed at someone with closed eyes." The elves turned to him with condemnation, calling him scum. Watching them, Mikhail thought that it was to be expected. One of the 5 that is 6 pulled such a trick. They put handcuffs on his hands. Having tied him to a chain, the guy led him in front of them. Gyro raised his hands tearfully asking why. Looking at him, Mikhail replied that when a company of 6 gathers, one of them always turns out to be a bastard, to which the elf turned around, menacingly ordering the guy to shut up. Holding the staff in his hand, Mikhail began to smile widely. Turning around to look at the surprised elf, he asked them to stop slowing down since they had already erased his friend's memories. Anyway, Jubero clenched his teeth in anger. Closing his eyes, he asked why Mikhail had even asked to show him the way to that place if it was the most dangerous in the dark forest. Mikhail looked up at him, asking if the elf was sure he wanted to talk about it so loudly since the place they were heading to was probably called Sacred Land by people like him. Jibber looked down in fear. Moth flew up to the guy, trembling, asking him to hide. Suddenly, screams were heard from the forest about how they hated strangers and would break him. While Mikhail looked around, looking closely, he saw the fairies of the dark forest who were menacingly saying that the light fairies were their complete opposites. Looking at the frightened moth, Mikhail thought that they were all focused on him. Mia furrowed her brows, saying that these little ones had become one with their ancestors, and they hated the light and wanted to spread misery and death. Baring his teeth, the monster said, "I hate it." With glowing eyes, he rushed forward, growling loudly. Leon grabbed his sword, shouting loudly that the dark fairies were approaching. Jibero ducked, saying that this was why he didn't want to come here. Hitting him with his staff, Mikhail ordered him to shut up. Looking at him out of the corner of his eye, Mikhail asked, "What kind of evil had these poor creatures been subjected to turn into such creatures?" Raising his head, the elf asked if the guy really wanted to save them and was actually thinking about such nonsense. Looking forward, Mikhail heard that the dark fairies would not respond to saving. Frowning, Gyro said that people like Mikhail always held on to such hopeless dreams. Swinging, Mikhail used a hero's strike, hitting the elf on the back of the head. Throwing his staff over his shoulder, he said that he would save these pathetic fairies. Looking ahead, the boy thought that their anger had changed them. But because of their original innocence and simplicity, there was a way to return them to their former state. Covering himself with a leaf, Mont said in fear that the fairies outnumbered them and were driving them into a trap. The boy leaned over and looked at him with a smile. Meeting his gaze, Mikhail asked why he was so afraid. Because he only needed to save his fellow fairies with his own hands. He carefully extended a small club forward. Smiling, Mikhail said, "Save with physical force." Watching them off, Mikhail thought that the curse could be removed from the fairies using the power of the same fairy. With wide eyes, Mott repeated that they needed to be saved. Looking at Mott, the boy thought that he knew a lot of ways to make him stronger. He carefully brought his hand to the Mott's back. Releasing a magical spell, Mikhail activated the blessing, enveloping the moth in mana. Raising his index finger, Mikhail pointed forward, smiling. He said that Ma's strength had increased, so now he could get down to business. Grabbing the club, the moth quickly flew forward, loudly screaming for salvation. That's how this video ends.